years. He had learned that the truth is often buried beneath layers of mud and time and requires patience too. The silence of the lake was no longer a mystery, but a comfort to the man who found the every dock has a story, and every surveyor has a case that they will never forget for as long. Gideon Vance was a man who saw the world through a lens of logic, but he learned to. The remote boat dock was his final mystery, and the one that stayed with him until the very farewell. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind in the pines and the water on the shore. The story was finished, and the circle was finally closed for the family of the man who watched. A dispatcher who heard something no one else did. The Regional Emergency Communications Center was a long, windowless room that sat on the quiet outskirts of the city. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old veteran of the graveyard shift who was known for his incredible hearing. He often spent his 12-hour shifts listening to the subtle rhythms of the facility and the city around him. Silas could distinguish the sound of a failing hard drive from the normal hum of the massive cooling fan units. His coworkers frequently teased him about his ability to hear a mouse scurrying behind the drywall of the break room. The night of November 12th started out as a very typical Tuesday with only a few calls regarding minor incidents. Most of the city was asleep, and the digital maps on the wall showed very little movement in the streets. Silas sat in his ergonomic chair and adjusted the volume on his specialized high-definition headset while sipping cold coffee. He watched the seconds tick by on the digital clock as the center reached its quietest point of the night. The clock on the wall shifted toward 3 in the morning when a sudden flicker appeared on his primary console. A single line lit up indicating an incoming emergency call, but there was no caller identification or location data. Silas pressed the button to accept the connection and gave his standard professional greeting into the small black microphone. He heard a very strange rhythmic tapping followed by a series of melodic chimes that sounded like a toy. The dispatcher asked the caller to state the nature of their emergency and provide a specific location for the units. There was no verbal response, but the music continued to play with a haunting and distorted quality in his ears. Silas signaled his supervisor, Victor Vance, to listen in on the mysterious line to help identify the strange source. Victor plugged his own headset into the secondary jack and listened intently for nearly 30 seconds before shaking his head. The supervisor told Silas that the line was completely silent and that he only heard the standard digital carrier hum. Silas insisted that a very specific nursery rhyme was playing, but the audio visualizer on the screen remained perfectly flat. The computer system indicated that no sound was being transmitted from the other end of the open telephone connection at. Silas adjusted his volume to the absolute maximum level and felt a cold chill as the music grew much louder. He recognized the tune as a popular nursery rhyme from his early childhood, but the tempo was much slower now. The call disconnected after exactly 60 seconds, leaving Silas in a state of deep confusion as he stared at monitors. Victor told him it was likely a hardware glitch or a ghost call caused by moisture in the underground cables. Silas could not stop thinking about the melody and decided to check the digital archives for any similar previous calls. He spent the next 3 hours scrolling through audio logs from the past decade, but found nothing that matched it. The dispatcher reached out to a department technician named Julian Reed to ask if the recording system could fail. Julian explained that the digital compression might strip away certain analog signals if they were extremely weak or very high. Silas realized that he might be the only person who could hear the signal because of his sensitive, specialized. He began researching the history of the industrial district and discovered it was once home to a large toy factory. The factory had reportedly burned down in 1995, and the entire area remained fenced off for many years. Silas found an old newspaper article about a missing child named Arlo Finch who disappeared near the factory grounds then. The article mentioned that Arlo was carrying a custom music box when he was last seen by his worried parents. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline as he connected the melody from the call to the description in the. He pulled the original police report from 1995 and noted the last known location of the missing boy. The report stated that the search was called off after 2 weeks because the ground was considered too unstable. Silas looked at the modern coordinates from the mysterious call and saw they matched the old factory basement location. He decided to visit the site during his lunch break because the mystery was keeping him from focusing on work. The industrial district was a desolate maze of rusted metal and crumbling brick walls covered in thick green ivy. Silas climbed over a collapsed section of the perimeter fence and walked toward the center of the old factory. He carried a handheld radio and a flashlight as he navigated through the debris and scattered remnants of iron machinery. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as he discovered a small opening in the concrete floor that led down into a sub-basement that was not. Silas lowered himself into the dark space and swept his flashlight across the dusty room until he saw it. Resting on a rusted metal shelf was a music box that looked remarkably well preserved despite the decades of decay. He reached out to touch the wooden casing and noticed a thin copper wire running from the box. The wire was connected to an ancient telephone junction box that was still receiving a very low amount of. Silas realized that the shifting of the building had caused the music box to wind up and trigger the cried. He heard a soft sound behind him and turned his light toward a corner where a small crawlspace was. Inside the crawlspace, he found a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to the missing boy from 1990. There were sketches and a small denim jacket along with a journal that described how the boy had hidden. The journal revealed that Arlo had found a way to survive for a short time by accessing a nearby. Silas called the police department and requested an immediate forensic team to secure the site and recover the remains. The investigation revealed that Arlo had become trapped after a structural collapse and could not find his way out. The music box had been his only comfort, and it somehow remained functional through a bizarre set of mechanical slongly. Technicians confirmed that the copper wire had acted as a primitive antenna that broadcast the sound during the heavy. The local news reported that the mystery of the missing boy was finally solved because of an observant emergency. Silas returned to his job at the communications center, but he never looked at the console in the same. He often wondered how many other voices were trapped in the old wires of the city waiting for someone. The music box was eventually placed in a museum as a reminder of the strange events that occurred. Victor apologized for doubting Silas and admitted that sometimes the technology we rely on does not capture the entire torn. The dispatcher felt a sense of peace, knowing that Arlo was no longer lost in the dark beneath the potty. He continued to work the graveyard shift and kept his headset volume high during the quietest hours of the time. Every time the clock struck 3, Silas would pause and listen for the faint melodic chimes of a. The city remained quiet, but the wires were alive with the echoes of stories that were never meant to. People in the town spoke about the miracle of the call for years and how the past found. Silas stayed at his post and watched the lights of the city while the world slept through the winter. He knew that some things could not be explained by science or digital recordings, but only by the human. The mystery of the industrial district was closed, but the memory of the melody stayed with him forever, and the archives at the police station were updated to reflect the new evidence that Silas had discovered in the. He visited the grave of Arlo Finch and left a small flower to honor the boy who was lost. His co-workers treated him with a new level of respect and often asked him to listen to strange noises. Silas became a mentor for new dispatchers and taught them to trust their instincts even when the computers showed. He explained that the job was about more than just typing notes and sending cars to locations across the start. It was about being a witness to the things that everyone else was too busy or too loud. The old music box never played again after it was removed from the damp basement of the abandoned factory. Technicians said the gears had finally rusted through once they were exposed to the fresh air of today. Silas Thorne retired from the dispatch center 20 years after the night he heard the music on the silent. He moved to a small house near the coast where the only sounds were the waves and the wind. Even in his old age, he could still hear the faint patterns in the world that others seemed. He wrote a book about his experiences and the importance of listening to the quietest whispers of our shared. The story of the dispatcher who heard the impossible became a legend in the world of emergency communications, and new recruits are still told the story during their first week of training at the academy to emphasize. They are told to keep their ears open for the sounds that do not appear on the glowing. The city continues to grow and change, but the old copper wires still hum with the electricity of Silas. Knows that the world is full of signals if you are only patient enough to wait for. He sits on his porch and listens to the world with a smile because he knows the truth. The silence is never truly empty for those who know how to listen to the heartbeat of the Silas Thorne lived a long and quiet life, knowing he had given a voice to a boy who the melody of the music box remains a part of the city, even if the physical gears have. Justice was finally served for the Finch family because a man in a headset refused to believe the line. The case remains one of the most unusual entries in the archived dispatch logs of the regional communication. Every year on November 12th, the dispatchers on the graveyard shift keep a moment of silence for Young. They look at the console and remember the man who heard a sound that no one else could. Silas once told a journalist that the most important part of his job was hearing what was not. He believed that the digital world often missed these small analog frequencies that define the reality of our human. The basement of the old factory was eventually filled with concrete to prevent anyone else from becoming trapped. But some people say that if you walk past the site at 3 in the morning, you can. They claim a faint melodic chime can still be heard drifting through the rustling leaves of the overgrown. Silas never went back to the site himself, but he kept a photo of Arlo on his desk. It served as a reminder that every call had a soul behind it, regardless of what the screen. The legacy of the sharp-eared dispatcher lives on in every person who chooses to listen to the world. The world is a loud place, but the truth often resides in the tiny spaces between the loud. Silas Thorne finished his story and closed his eyes while the wind carried the secrets of the sea. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Echoes Whispers. I know a lot of you like to listen to these videos while you're winding down or falling asleep, so before you drift off, take a moment to drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. What police discovered behind this locked storage door? The relentless summer sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of the storage facility lot in Central California. Tobias Vance wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and adjusted the brim of his faded blue cap. He had worked as the site manager at Secure Keep Storage for nearly 6 years without seeing much excitement. The job mostly consisted of chasing late payments and sweeping dust from the long concrete hallways. Today was supposed to be a standard Tuesday dedicated to auditing the overdue units on the Western Row. Tobias grabbed his heavy ring of keys and a thick clipboard from the hook behind the front desk. He poured a cup of lukewarm coffee into his travel mug and headed out toward the loading bay. The facility was a sprawling maze of corrugated metal doors and numbered corridors that smelled of dry dust. Tobias walked down the aisle of Sector 4 and checked the list of units scheduled for auction processing. Most of these lockers contained abandoned furniture or boxes of old clothes that were not worth much money. He stopped in front of Unit 404, which had been rented to a man named Arthur Pence. The record showed that the rent had been paid by money order every month since 1998. The payments had stopped abruptly 3 months ago, and all certified letters to the address had returned unclaimed. Tobias sighed as he pulled the large pair of red bolt cutters from his tool belt for the job. He positioned the jaws of the cutter around the rusted shackle of the padlock and applied steady pressure. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that echoed loudly down the empty corridor of the storage building. Tobias removed the broken lock and slid the latch over to lift the heavy rolling metal door. The door rumbled as it retracted into the ceiling and revealed the dark space inside the unit. He clicked on his heavy flashlight and shone the beam into the dusty gloom to assess the contents. The unit appeared to be filled with stacks of cardboard boxes and old, mismatched wooden furniture pieces. A layer of gray dust coated everything and suggested that no one had entered in a very long time. Tobias stepped inside and began his standard inventory process to determine if the contents were worth a public auction. He opened the first box and found it filled with yellowed newspapers from the late 1990s. The next box contained kitchenware that looked like it had been packed away in a hurried panic. He moved a heavy oak wardrobe to the side to check the back corner of the storage unit. His flashlight beam hit the back wall, and he noticed something strange about the spacing of the panels. The unit should have been 20 feet deep, but the back wall seemed to be 5 feet closer. He tapped on the white metal wall, and it produced a hollow sound that was different from the others. Tobias looked closer at the seam where the wall met the floor and saw a faint scratch mark. He gripped the edge of the metal panel and pulled it hard to see if it would move. The panel slid to the left on a hidden track and revealed a heavy steel door behind it. This inner door was reinforced and fitted with a modern electronic keypad that looked very expensive and new. Tobias stared at the door and felt a cold chill run down his spine despite the heat. This was not a standard setup, and it was certainly not authorized by the facility, ownership, or management. He retreated from the unit and immediately pulled his cell phone from his pocket to call the local police. The dispatcher listened to his description of the hidden room and promised to send a patrol unit over. Tobias stood outside the unit and waited nervously while he watched the entrance for the police cruiser to arrive. Officer Mara Holloway pulled up 10 minutes later and stepped out of her vehicle with a serious expression. She walked over to Tobias and he explained the situation while pointing toward the open door of the unit. They walked back inside and Tobias showed her the false wall and the reinforced door hidden behind it. Officer Holloway examined the keypad and noted that it was still active with a faint green light blinking. She called for backup and requested a warrant based on the suspicious modification and the potential for illegal activity. 2 more officers arrived within the hour and brought heavy tools to breach the reinforced door safely. They used a hydraulic tool to force the steel frame, and the lock disengaged with a loud metallic groan. The door swung open and a rush of stale and cool air flowed out from the hidden chamber. Tobias stayed back near the entrance of the unit while the officers moved in with their weapons drawn. The hidden room was not filled with drugs or stolen goods as Tobias had initially expected to find. It was set up as a small and functional living space with a cot and a desk. The walls were lined with corkboards that were covered in maps and photographs and handwritten notes. Officer Holloway holstered her weapon and signaled that the area was clear for them to examine the evidence. Tobias stepped forward cautiously and looked at the strange collection of items that filled the cramped secret room. The desk was cluttered with radio equipment and a stack of notebooks that were filled with dense writing. Officer Holloway picked up one of the notebooks and read the first page with a deep frown on her face. She motioned for her partner to start photographing the maps that were pinned to the walls of the room. The maps depicted the city's sewer system and the electrical grid with specific locations marked in red ink. Tobias looked at the photographs and realized they were surveillance pictures of a specific building downtown. The building in the photos was the main branch of the First National Bank on 4th Street. The photos showed the bank from various angles and at different times of the day and night. The notes on the board detailed the shift changes of the security guards and the armored truck schedules. It became clear that the tenant of this unit had been planning a massive robbery for decades. Officer Holloway moved to a metal shelving unit in the corner and found a row of videotapes. The labels on the tapes had dates that went back to the year 2001. She checked the equipment on the desk and found a scanner that was tuned to the police frequency. The tenant had been monitoring law enforcement communications from this soundproof room for a very long time. Tobias noticed a small cooler in the corner of the room and pointed it out to the officers. Officer Holloway put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully opened the lid of the plastic cooler. Inside, she found several stacks of cash that were wrapped in plastic bands and clearly marked. The bands bore the stamp of a bank that had been robbed in 2005. That robbery had been a high-profile case where the thief had vanished without a trace. The police had never identified a suspect, and the case had gone cold after a few years. It appeared that the thief had been living right here in the storage unit the entire time. The officers began to search the rest of the room for any sign of the tenant himself. They found a sleeping bag rolled up on the cot and a pile of canned food nearby. There was also a calendar on the wall that had been marked off until 3 months ago. The last marked date coincided with the time that the rent payments had stopped coming to the office. Officer Holloway looked under the cot and found a small metal box that was locked with a key. She used a small pry bar to pop the lid of the box open on the desk. Inside the box was a driver license and a set of old keys and a wedding ring. The license belonged to a man named Gerald Finch, who had been reported missing in 1999. Finch had been a security consultant for the very bank that had been robbed in 2005. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together for the officers standing in the small room. Finch had staged his own disappearance and then used his inside knowledge to rob the bank later. He had lived in this hidden room to avoid detection and spend his stolen money very slowly. Tobias felt a wave of shock as he realized he had walked past this unit for years. He had likely passed Gerald Finch in the hallway without ever knowing who the man really was. The officers continued to catalog the evidence and found a journal that explained the final days. The last entry in the journal described severe chest pains and a fear of going to a hospital. Finch had written that he knew his time was running out and he had nowhere to go. He had apparently died somewhere else or managed to leave the facility before collapsing in the street. Officer Holloway called dispatch to check the records of unidentified bodies found in the last 3 months. There was a report of a John Doe who had died of a heart attack at a bus stop. The description of the deceased man matched the photo on the driver license found in the box. The mystery of the missing security consultant and the bank robbery was finally solved in this room. Tobias watched as the police evidence team arrived to bag the cash and the surveillance tapes. The facility owner arrived shortly after and spoke with the police about the unauthorized construction of the room. He was just as shocked as Tobias to learn that a fugitive had been living within the walls. The story of the discovery spread quickly through the small town and made the local evening news. Reporters camped out in front of the storage facility for days, hoping to get a glimpse inside. Tobias gave a statement to the police, but refused to speak to the news cameras on the scene. He just wanted to get back to his normal routine of managing the quiet storage facility. The investigation revealed that Finch had used a fake identity to rent the unit and buy supplies. He had installed the false wall himself at night when the facility was closed and empty. The power for the room had been siphoned from the main line that ran through the ceiling. The ventilation system had been tied into the existing ducts to keep the air fresh inside. It was a brilliant and desperate setup that had allowed him to hide in plain sight. The police estimated that he had lived there for nearly 20 years without raising any suspicion. Tobias thought about the countless times he had walked down that hallway and heard nothing at all. The insulation in the false wall was incredibly thick and blocked any sound from the inside. Finch had lived a ghost life surrounded by his stolen wealth, but unable to truly enjoy it. The tragic nature of the situation lingered in the mind of Tobias long after the police left. The unit was eventually cleared out and the false wall was torn down by a construction crew. The space was returned to its original size and rented out to a new tenant the next month. But Tobias never looked at Unit 404 the same way again after that day. He always paused for a second when he walked past it during his daily facility inspections. He wondered if there were other secrets hidden behind the thousands of locked doors in the facility. The experience taught him that you never really know what is happening in the spaces around you. It was a sobering reminder that everyone has a story and some people go to great lengths to hide. The discovery of the hidden room became a local legend that people whispered about for years. The bank eventually recovered a portion of the stolen money, but much of it had been spent. The rest of the cash was returned to the insurance company that had covered the loss years ago. The case of Gerald Finch was officially closed by the police department thanks to the discovery by Tobias. He received a small reward from the bank for his role in recovering the stolen funds. Tobias used the money to take a long vacation and stepped away from the storage business for a while. He needed some time to clear his head and forget about the man in the wall. When he returned to work, he was more diligent than ever about checking the units and the records. He made sure to inspect the walls and the dimensions of every empty unit he cleaned. He never found another hidden room or a secret fugitive living in the facility again. But the memory of that hot Tuesday afternoon stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was the day that a simple bolt cutter revealed a secret that had been buried for decades. The mundane world of storage units had proven to be far more mysterious than he imagined. Tobias often told the story to new employees as a warning to always be observant. He wanted them to understand that their job was not just about sweeping floors and cutting locks. It was about maintaining the security and the integrity of the place where people kept their lives. The storage facility was a repository of memories, and sometimes those memories were dark and dangerous. The legacy of Arthur Pence or Gerald Finch remained a part of the facility history forever. It was a strange footnote in the quiet life of Tobias Vance and the town of Modesto. The police kept the surveillance logs as evidence for training on how patient criminals could be. The level of detail in the planning was disturbing to the detectives who analyzed the notebooks. Finch had known the names of every bank employee and their daily habits and schedules. He had watched them from the shadows and planned his crime with mathematical precision. It was chilling to think that he had been watching the town for so long undetected. The false wall had been his shield against the world and his prison at the same time. Tobias sometimes wondered if Finch had regretted his choices in those final lonely days in the dark. The journal entries suggested a deep sadness and a longing for a normal life he lost. He had traded his freedom for a pile of cash that he could not openly spend. It was a cautionary tale about greed and the high price of living a lie. The hidden room was a testament to the wasted potential of a brilliant but misguided man. Tobias felt a strange pity for the man who had died alone with his secrets. The storage facility eventually changed ownership and was renovated with new security cameras and gates. The old corridors were painted and the lighting was improved to eliminate the dark corners. But the story of Unit 404 was passed down to the new management team. It served as a reminder that security was not just about fences and cameras and codes, it was about knowing who was on the property and what they were doing there. Tobias retired a few years later and moved to a smaller town near the coast. He enjoyed the fresh ocean air and the open spaces that were far from the cramped hallways. He never rented a storage unit for his own belongings after his experience at the facility. He preferred to keep his possessions close where he could see them and know they were safe. The mystery of the locked door had changed his perspective on privacy and hidden spaces. He knew that some doors were better left unopened and some secrets were better left found. But he was proud that he had done his job and brought the truth to light. The case of the hidden room remains one of the strangest events in the history of the town. It is a story that reminds people that the truth is often stranger than fiction. The most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary secrets if you look closely enough. Tobias Vance was just a man doing his job who stumbled into a mystery, and that mystery revealed the hidden life of a man who had vanished from the world. It was a discovery that no one expected behind a locked storage door. The final report from the police stated that the room was a masterpiece of concealment. The carpentry work on the false wall was professional and nearly impossible to detect visually. If Tobias had not noticed the depth difference, the room might have remained hidden forever. The next tenant might have filled the unit with boxes and never known about the space behind. It was a stroke of luck and attention to detail that solved the cold case. The incident highlighted the importance of being thorough in even the most routine tasks. Tobias sat on his porch years later and watched the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. He thought about the dust and the silence of the storage facility he had left behind. He was glad to be out in the open air where nothing was hidden from view. The world was full of secrets, but he was done uncovering them for a while. He took a sip of his tea and let the memory of the hidden room fade. It was just a story now, and he was happy to let it be just that. This recorded call changed a small town forever. The heavy rain hammered relentlessly against the dark reinforced glass of the dispatch center in the quiet town of Oakhaven. Elias Thorne adjusted his headset and took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee from his chipped ceramic mug. He had been working the graveyard shift for 7 years and usually enjoyed the deep silence of the night. The town was nestled in the Pacific Northwest and was surrounded by miles of dense and ancient pine forests. Most of the calls at this hour were related to minor noise complaints or traffic accidents on the highway. Elias glanced at the digital clock on his console, which read exactly 3:14 in the morning. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair and watched the heavy rain streak down the windows like running tears. The silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the sharp and rhythmic ringing of the emergency line. Elias sat up straight and tapped the answer button on his console with a practiced and steady hand. He spoke his standard greeting and asked the caller to state their emergency clearly for the official record. There was no immediate response from the other end of the line, only the sound of heavy static. Elias repeated his question and pressed the volume up button to hear the background noise more clearly. He heard a strange clicking sound, followed by a heavy silence that felt very oppressive and intentional to him. Then a voice broke through the static, and it sounded like it was coming from a deep tunnel. It was a male voice that sounded rough and strained, as if the person had been crying recently. The man was not speaking to Elias, but seemed to be talking to someone else in the room. He was apologizing over and over again for something that had happened a very long time ago. Elias quickly started the trace program on his computer to locate the precise origin of the strange call. The voice on the line continued to ramble about a red door and a missing silver key. The trace came back with a location on the outskirts of town near the abandoned lumber mill property. The address belonged to a dilapidated farmhouse that had been empty since the year 1999. Elias signaled for Officer Silas Reed, who was on patrol in that sector, to respond to the scene. He kept the line open and listened intently to the disturbing monologue coming from the other end. The man was describing a location in the woods where the ground was always soft and wet. He mentioned a specific oak tree that had been struck by lightning nearly 2 decades ago during a storm. Officer Reed acknowledged the dispatch and turned his cruiser toward the Old Mill Road without hesitation. The rain was turning the dirt road into thick mud and making the drive difficult and dangerous. Elias relayed the information from the call to Reed as he drove through the blinding storm that night. The voice on the phone suddenly stopped speaking and was replaced by a high-pitched mechanical whine. It sounded like a tape rewinding or an old machine struggling to operate properly in the damp air. Elias realized with a sudden jolt that he might be listening to a recording rather than a live person. The line went dead with a loud click before Elias could ask any more questions to the caller. He stared at his screen and felt a deep sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. He tried to call the number back, but got a disconnected signal tone immediately after dialing the digits. Officer Reed arrived at the farmhouse 10 minutes later and reported that the property looked completely desolate. The windows were boarded up with plywood and the front porch was sagging under the weight of rot. Reed drew his heavy flashlight and his service weapon as he approached the front door cautiously in the rain. He pushed the door open and it creaked loudly on rusted hinges in the wet night air. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and revealed a dusty hallway filled with old debris. Reed announced his presence loudly, but there was no answer from inside the dark and empty house. He moved room by room and checked for any sign of a squatter or recent intruder. The house smelled of mildew and old wood and damp earth from the storm raging outside the walls. He reached the kitchen at the back of the house and found something sitting on the rotting table. It was an old reel-to-reel tape recorder that was plugged into a portable battery pack. A telephone handset was lying next to the speaker of the machine, which had been taken off the hook. Someone had rigged the device to play the tape into the phone and then disconnected the line. Reed secured the scene and called for a detective to come out and process the strange evidence. This was not a random prank, but a deliberate attempt to send a message to the local police. Elias listened to the initial report from Reed and felt a cold chill run down his spine. Detective Miller arrived at the scene an hour later to collect the recorder and the magnetic tape. They brought the device back to the station where the audio equipment was much better for analysis. Elias stayed past the end of his shift because he needed to know what was on that tape. They set up the reel in the evidence room and prepared to play it from the very beginning. The tape started with a long period of silence followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. Then, the voice that Elias had heard on the phone began to speak again clearly and without static. The audio quality was much higher on the master tape than it had been over the phone line. They could hear background noises that had been lost in the transmission of the call that morning. There was the sound of a train whistle blowing in the distance at regular intervals on the recording. Detective Miller noted that the train tracks near the mill had been removed in 2001. This confirmed that the recording had been made at least 20 years ago or possibly even earlier. The man on the tape was confessing to a crime that had haunted the town for decades. He spoke about a girl named Sarah who had vanished on her way home from school one afternoon. Sarah had gone missing in 1998 and her body had never been found by the police. The man on the tape described exactly how he had lured her into his car that day. He detailed the route he took into the woods and where he had buried her body afterwards. He mentioned the lightning-struck oak tree that Elias had heard about during the initial phone call. The level of detail in the confession was sickening and left no doubt about its authenticity to the officers. Detective Miller stopped the tape and looked at Elias with a grim expression on his face. They needed to identify the voice on the tape to catch the killer if he was still alive. Elias suggested they run the audio through the digital database to check for potential voice matches. The town was small enough that the police had records of many residents over the last 30 years. They isolated a clear section of the speech and fed it into the computer system for analysis. The software took several minutes to process the audio file while they waited in the silent room. The results came back with a 90% match to a man named Arthur Vance who lived nearby. Arthur Vance was a prominent figure in the community who had served on the town council for years. He was known for his charity work and had even helped organize the search for Sarah back then. The revelation that he could be the killer sent a shockwave through the small room of officers. Detective Miller immediately requested a warrant to search the property that Vance owned near the woods. They also needed to bring Vance in for questioning immediately before he could flee the area that morning. A convoy of police vehicles headed out to the Vance residence as the sun began to rise. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy with dark clouds. Arthur Vance was eating breakfast on his porch when the police cars pulled into his long driveway. He did not run or fight, but simply set down his coffee cup and sighed deeply. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Detective Miller read him his rights and placed him in the back of the patrol car without incident. Meanwhile, another team of officers went to the location described in the tape recording near the old mill. They found the old oak tree, which was now just a blackened stump covered in thick green moss. The ground around the tree was overgrown with thick brush and thorny blackberry vines that tore their clothes. They brought in a cadaver dog to search the area for any sign of human remains buried there. The dog alerted on a patch of earth about 20 feet behind the old tree stump almost immediately. The officers began to dig carefully with shovels and trowels to preserve any evidence they might find. It took 4 hours of digging before they found the first piece of clothing in the dirt. It was a tattered blue backpack that matched the description of the one Sarah had carried that day. A few moments later, they uncovered skeletal remains wrapped in a heavy plastic tarp that was preserved. The forensic team moved in to document the scene and recover the body for proper identification. Elias watched the news footage from the station and felt a heavy sadness for the family of the girl. The mystery of what happened to Sarah had finally been solved after all these years of wondering. The interrogation of Arthur Vance revealed the strange truth about the phone call that came in that night. Vance had not made the call himself, nor had he set up the tape player in the farmhouse. He claimed that he had kept the tape in a safe deposit box as a twisted memento. He had recently stopped paying for the box, and the contents were sent to his estranged son. His son had listened to the tape and recognized the voice of his father immediately and with horror. The son was too afraid to confront his father or walk into the police station himself with it. Instead, he had broken into the abandoned farmhouse and set up the elaborate call to the police. He wanted the police to hear the confession without having to testify against his own father in court. It was a desperate act by a young man who was burdened with a terrible truth he found. The police located the son a few days later, and he corroborated the entire story to them. He was not charged with any crime, given the extenuating circumstances and his cooperation with the investigation. Arthur Vance was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping based on the overwhelming evidence found. The trial was a short affair because the voice on the tape was undeniable proof of his guilt. Vance pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and accepted a sentence of life in prison without parole. The town of Oak Haven was forever changed by the events of that rainy Tuesday morning in August. The people realized that a monster had been living among them in plain sight for decades without suspicion. The trust that had held the small community together was fractured and took years to heal completely. Elias continued to work as a dispatcher, but the job felt different to him now after that night. He found himself listening closer to every call and analyzing every background noise he heard on the line. He realized that the truth often hid in the quiet spaces between the words people spoke to him. The recording of Arthur Vance was archived as a case study in criminal psychology at the State Academy. It showed how guilt could be preserved on magnetic tape long after the crime was committed. The farmhouse where the call originated was eventually torn down by the city safety inspectors a year later. The land was cleared and left empty as a silent memorial to the tragedy that was revealed there. Sarah was given a proper burial in the town cemetery next to her parents who had passed away. A large crowd gathered to pay their respects and finally say goodbye to the lost girl. Elias stood at the back of the service and watched the leaves fall from the trees in silence. He thought about the random nature of the discovery and how close the secret came to being lost. If the son had simply thrown the tape away, the truth would have remained buried forever. It was a reminder that justice sometimes arrives in strange and unexpected ways when we least expect it. The case became a legend in the county and was discussed by rookie officers for years to come. They talked about the ghost call that solved the coldest case in the history of the department. Elias eventually retired from the dispatch center and moved to a small cabin near the lake. He enjoyed the peace and quiet of retirement, but he never owned a tape recorder again. The sound of a tape rewinding always brought him back to that dark morning in the dispatch room. He preferred the sound of the wind in the trees and the water lapping at the shore. The town of Oakhaven slowly returned to normal, but the shadow of the case lingered for a long time. Parents held their children a little closer, and people locked their doors at night with more care. The innocence that had defined the town in the 90s was gone for good after the discovery. But in its place was a new sense of vigilance and a commitment to looking out for one another. The community had survived the darkness and come out the other side stronger than before the incident. They knew that evil could hide behind a friendly face and a well-manicured lawn in their town. The recording itself was digitized and stored on a secure server in the state capitol for safekeeping. It was rarely accessed, but it remained there as a testament to the victim and the crime. Every year on the anniversary of the call, Elias would light a single candle in his window. It was his small way of remembering the voice that had come through the static that night. He hoped that somewhere Sarah was at peace now that the truth was known to the world. The rain continued to fall on Oakhaven just as it had on that fateful night so long ago. But now the rain felt different to Elias, like it was washing away the stains of the past. He sat on his porch and watched the storm clouds roll over the mountains in the distance. The world was full of secrets, and he was glad that he was done uncovering them for now. He took a sip of his tea and let the memory of the red door fade away. The phone in his cabin rang once, and he let it go to voicemail without moving. He knew it was just a telemarketer or a wrong number, but he did not want to check. Some calls were better left unanswered, and some voices were better left unheard in the dark. The story of the recorded call was just one chapter in the long history of the town, but it was the chapter that everyone remembered and the one that changed everything for the people there. It proved that the past is never truly gone and that it can call out when you least expect. Elias Thorne had found a voice that had echoed through time to bring justice to the forgotten. The investigation into Arthur Vance also uncovered other crimes of embezzlement from the town funds over the years. He had been stealing money for years to pay for his silence and his comfort in life. The betrayal of the public trust was total and absolute in every aspect of his life in Oakhaven. The council implemented new oversight rules to ensure that no one person held that much power again. It was a painful lesson in governance and the importance of checks and balances for the small town. The legacy of Vance was one of shame and deceit that would last for generations to come. Elias often wondered about the son and where he had gone after the trial ended that year. Rumors said he had changed his name and moved to the East Coast to start over completely. It was probably the best thing for him to escape the shadow of his father's name and crimes. Elias hoped the young man found some peace and a life free from the burden of the secret. It took a lot of courage to turn in his own flesh and blood to the police. That act of bravery was the one bright spot in a very dark and tragic story. The dispatch center was upgraded with new technology a few years after Elias left the job. The old analog systems were replaced with digital tracking and high-speed connections for better response times. But the veteran dispatchers still told the story of the call to the new hires during training. They used it as an example of why you never dismiss a call, no matter how strange it sounds. You never know when a simple hang-up or a static-filled line could be the key to a case. It was the most important lesson that a dispatcher could ever learn on the job in Oakhaven. The old mill where the search had started was eventually turned into a public park for the town. The trails were paved and the dangerous machinery was removed for safety reasons to protect the children. Families walked their dogs and had picnics in the shadow of the old industrial buildings on weekends, It was a nice transformation that brought life back to a place that had been dead for years. But deep in the woods behind the park, the stump of the oak tree remained undisturbed. It was left alone as a solemn marker of the history of the land and the tragedy. Nature slowly reclaimed the site and covered the scars in the earth with green growth and flowers. The blackberry vines grew back thicker than before and hid the ground from view once again. But the people of Oakhaven knew what had happened there, and they respected the space and the memory. It was a part of their collective memory that would not be erased by time or weather. The story of the recorded call passed into the folklore of the region as a warning to all. It was a story about technology and conscience and the inevitable nature of truth coming to light. Elias sat by his fireplace and watched the flames dance on the logs in the hearth that night. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had done his part to help the town. He had been the one to answer the phone and the one to listen when no one else would. It was a small role in the grand scheme of things, but it was a vital one. He closed his eyes and listened to the crackle of the fire and the rain on the roof. The silence of the night was no longer oppressive, but comforting and full of peace for him. He knew that the town was safe for now, and that was enough for him to sleep soundly. The darkness had receded, and the light had returned to Oakhaven at last after the long storm. The phone on the table remained silent, and Elias smiled to himself in the warm glow of the fire. He was finally truly off the clock, and he intended to stay that way for the rest of his life. The call that changed the town had also changed him in ways he was just beginning to understand, and as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he would never forget the voice on the tape. The confession of a guilty man had set a town free from its past and brought justice home. It was a strange irony that a recording of a crime became the instrument of justice in the end. But life was full of strange turns, and Elias had seen more than his fair share of them. He slept soundly that night without any dreams of red doors or missing keys or static. The morning sun would rise on a town that was a little wiser and a little sadder than before. But it was a town that was finally honest with itself, and that was a good thing for everyone. Never answer a phone ringing in this abandoned building. The heavy iron gates of the Blackwood textile mill shrieked loudly as Silas Cade pushed them open that morning. He had driven for 2 hours through the dense fog of the Pacific Northwest to reach the remote site. Silas was a structural engineer who specialized in assessing dangerous industrial properties for potential demolition or renovation projects. The mill had been the economic heart of the small town of Oakhaven until it closed in 1998. It had sat abandoned and rotting in the damp climate for over 2 decades before the city council intervened. They wanted to tear the dangerous structure down and replace it with a new community park and nature trail. Silas grabbed his heavy flashlight and his tablet from the passenger seat of his muddy pickup truck. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine needles and the metallic tang of rusting machinery. He zipped up his thick canvas jacket against the biting wind and walked toward the main entrance. The massive brick building loomed over him like a dark fortress with shattered windows that looked like jagged teeth. He stepped through the missing front doors and crunched over a layer of broken glass and peeling paint chips. The interior was cavernous and silent, except for the steady drip of water falling from the leaking roof above. Silas clicked on his powerful flashlight and swept the beam across the vast expanse of the main production floor. Massive looms and weaving machines still sat in rows like dormant metal beasts, waiting for workers who would never return. He began his inspection by checking the load-bearing columns near the entrance for signs of critical failure. Silas moved methodically through the ground floor and took photos of the water damage and the crumbling brick walls. He made notes on his tablet about the hazardous materials that would need to be removed before demolition could begin. The atmosphere in the mill was oppressive and heavy, as if the building itself was watching him work. He reached the back of the production floor and found the stairwell that led up to the administrative offices. The stairs were made of steel and seemed stable enough to support his weight as he climbed upward. He reached the second floor landing and found himself in a long hallway lined with frosted glass doors. This area had been the domain of the managers and the payroll clerks who ran the business side of the mill. Silas pushed open the first door on his left and found an office filled with overturned filing cabinets. Papers from the late 1990s were scattered across the floor and covered in a thick layer of gray dust. He walked down the hall and checked each room to ensure there were no squatters or animals living inside. The silence of the building was suddenly broken by a sound that made Silas freeze in his tracks instantly. It was the sharp and mechanical ring of a telephone echoing from one of the offices at the end of the hall. He stood perfectly still and listened as the phone rang again with a loud and insistent trill. His mind raced to find a logical explanation for a working phone in a building abandoned for 20 years. The power had been cut decades ago, and the landlines should have been dead long before that day. Curiosity overcame his initial fear, and he moved slowly toward the source of the strange ringing sound. He reached the last door on the right, which had a clouded glass panel with the word director stenciled on it. The ringing was coming from inside this office, and it seemed to get louder as he reached for the knob. Silas pushed the door open and shone his light onto a large mahogany desk that sat in the center. A heavy black rotary telephone was sitting on the dusty blotter and vibrating with each mechanical ring. He stared at the device in disbelief as it continued to demand his attention in the empty room. Silas walked around the desk and hesitated for a moment before he reached out to lift the receiver. He held the cold plastic against his ear and said hello in a voice that shook slightly. There was a moment of static on the line, followed by the sound of heavy and ragged breathing. A voice whispered on the other end, and it sounded like a young woman who was terrified and crying. She said that she was trapped in the drawing room and she could hear him walking outside the door. Silas asked who she was and told her that he was a structural engineer inspecting the building alone. The woman did not seem to hear him and continued to beg for help in a frantic whisper. She said that the man who took her had locked the heavy metal door and left her in the dark. She mentioned that the air was getting thin and she was so cold that she could not feel her fingers. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline and told her to stay on the line while he came to find her. He dropped the receiver onto the desk and ran out of the office and back toward the stairwell. He knew from the floor plans that the drying rooms were located in the basement level of the facility. He bounded down the steel stairs, taking them two at a time and risking a serious fall in his haste. The voice on the phone had sounded so real and immediate that he did not question the logic. He reached the ground floor and sprinted across the production floor toward the heavy freight elevator in the corner. The elevator was obviously broken, so he found these service stairs that led down into the darkness of the basement. The air grew colder and smelled of mold and stagnant water as he descended into the bowels of the mill. He reached the bottom and found himself in a maze of concrete corridors that were lined with rusted pipes. He shouted hello, but his voice just echoed off the damp walls and faded into the silence. Silas checked his tablet for the location of the drying rooms and saw they were in the east wing. He ran down the corridor and swept his light from side to side, looking for the heavy metal doors. He finally found a row of industrial steel doors that were used to seal the fabric drying chambers. Most of the doors were hanging open or missing entirely, but one door at the end was shut tight. He ran to the closed door and pounded on the metal surface with his fist while shouting for the woman. There was no answer from inside the chamber, and the heavy iron latch was rusted into the locked position. Silas looked around for something to use as a pry bar and found a length of steel pipe nearby. He jammed the pipe into the mechanism of the latch and pulled with all his strength to break the seal. The rust gave way with a loud screech, and the latch popped up, allowing the door to swing open. Silas shone his light into the small windowless room and prepared himself to help the trapped woman inside. But the room was completely empty except for a pile of old rags in the far corner of the floor. There was no young woman and no sign that anyone had been in the room for many years. Silas stepped inside and walked over to the pile of rags to inspect them more closely in the light. He realized with a jolt of horror that the rags were actually a decayed backpack and a blue jacket. Underneath the clothing, he saw the unmistakable shape of human skeletal remains curled into a fetal position. He stumbled back from the gruesome discovery and covered his mouth to suppress a wave of nausea. This was not a rescue mission anymore, but the discovery of a crime scene that was decades old. Silas retreated from the basement and ran back up the stairs to the ground floor where he had cell service. He called the county sheriff and reported that he had found human remains in the basement of the mill. He waited outside by his truck in the rain and tried to process the impossible events of the last hour. Sheriff Miller arrived 20 minutes later with 2 deputies and a team of paramedics who were not needed. Silas led them down to the basement and showed them the drying room and the remains on the floor. The sheriff secured the scene and called for the coroner and the state forensic team to come out. They spent the rest of the day processing the scene and collecting evidence from the damp concrete room. Silas gave his statement to the sheriff and explained exactly how he had found the location of the body. He told them about the ringing phone and the terrifying conversation he had with the woman on the line. Sheriff Miller looked at him with a skeptical expression but wrote down every detail in his notebook. The sheriff asked Silas to show him the office where he had answered the phone call earlier that morning. They walked up to the second floor and entered the director's office, which was still undisturbed. The black rotary phone was sitting on the desk with the receiver lying on the blotter where Silas left it. Sheriff Miller walked behind the desk and followed the cord of the phone down to the floor. He picked up the end of the cord and showed Silas that it was severed and frayed at the tip. The wire had been cut or chewed through by rats years ago and was not connected to any wall jack. There was absolutely no way that the phone could have rung or received a call without power or connection. Silas stared at the severed cord and felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew what he had heard, and he knew that the voice had led him directly to the body. The forensic team later identified the remains as those of a girl named Lena Graves. Lena had gone missing in 1999 on her way home from the local high school. She had been 16 years old, and her disappearance had been the biggest unsolved mystery in the town history. The police found a student ID card in the backpack that confirmed her identity beyond any doubt. The discovery of her body reignited the investigation and brought new leads to the cold case detectives. They found DNA evidence on the zipper of the jacket that did not belong to the victim. The technology had improved vastly since 1999, and they were able to run a familial search. The DNA led them to a man named Gordon Black, who had worked as a shift supervisor at the mill. Black was still living in the area and was now a retired grandfather who thought he had gotten away with murder. The police arrested Black and confronted him with the DNA evidence found on the clothing of the victim. He eventually confessed that he had abducted Lena and brought her to the mill, which was closed at the time. He admitted that he had locked her in the drying room to keep her hidden while he went to move his car. He claimed that he lost the key to the room in the dark and panicked when he could not open it. He had fled the scene and left her trapped in the soundproof chamber to die alone in the dark. The confession matched the details that Silas had heard on the impossible phone call that morning. The girl had said she was trapped and that the man had locked the door and left her there. Silas realized that he had heard the final moments of Lena Graves playing out across time. It was a phenomenon that defied all scientific explanation, but the result was undeniable justice. Gordon Black was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The town of Oak Haven was finally able to put the mystery of the missing girl to rest. Lena was given a proper burial next to her parents who had died without ever knowing the truth. Silas Cade finished his inspection of the mill a week later, but he refused to work alone. He brought a partner with him, and they stayed in radio contact constantly while they were inside. He never went back into the director's office, and he never touched another phone in an abandoned building. The mill was eventually demolished as planned, and the new park was named in memory of Lena Graves. The dark brick fortress that had loomed over the town was replaced by green grass and walking paths. But Silas never visited the park even after it was completed and open to the public. He could not shake the memory of the voice on the phone and the fear in her tone. He often wondered why he was the one chosen to receive that message after so many years. Perhaps it was simply because he was the first person to walk down that hallway in a long time. Or maybe the energy of the tragic event had been waiting for someone who would listen and act. The story of the phone call became a local legend that was whispered around campfires in Oakhaven. Most people dismissed it as a ghost story or a fabrication to make the discovery more dramatic. But the police report contained the official statement from Silas about the call that led to the body. And the sheriff could never explain how Silas knew exactly which door in the basement to open. There were dozens of drying rooms in the facility, and searching them all would have taken days. Silas had walked straight to the correct door because the voice had told him where she was. It was a chilling reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it is buried. The severed phone cord was placed in the evidence locker along with the other items from the case. It sat in a plastic bag as a silent testament to the impossible connection that solved the crime. Silas eventually moved away from the Pacific Northwest and took a job in a sunny southern state. He wanted to be far away from the dark forests and the rain and the old industrial ruins, but he found that he could not escape the memory of that day no matter where he went. Every time a phone rang in a quiet room, he would flinch and feel a spike of anxiety. He started keeping his cell phone on silent mode permanently to avoid the sudden, jarring sound of a ring. The experience had changed his view of the world and the boundaries of what was possible. He knew that there were things in this life that could not be measured by engineering or science. The mill was gone, but the echo of the tragedy remained in his mind forever. He often thought about Lena and hoped that she had finally found peace after being found. The justice system had worked, but it was 20 years too late to save her life. Silas took some comfort in knowing that her killer was behind bars and could not hurt anyone else. But the guilt of not being able to do more weighed on him even though it was irrational. He was just a man who answered a call that should not have been possible. And that call had changed the course of justice for a small town that had lost hope. The case of the phantom call was studied by paranormal researchers who read about it in the papers. They theorized that the emotional energy of the victim had imprinted on the location. The phone was simply a conduit for that energy to manifest when a receiver was nearby. It was a fascinating theory, but it offered little comfort to the man who had lived through it. Silas preferred to think of it as a final plea for help that finally reached the right person. He was a man who fixed broken structures, but this was one thing he could not fix. He could only witness the aftermath and do his best to set things right in the present. The demolition of the mill had revealed many secrets, including hidden stashes of alcohol and stolen goods, but none were as significant as the secret hidden behind the steel door of the drying room. The workers who tore down the building reported feeling cold spots and hearing whispers in the basement. They worked quickly to finish the job and clear the debris from the site. The ground was blessed by a local priest before the park construction began. It was a gesture of respect for the tragedy that had occurred on that soil. The town moved on, but they never forgot the girl who had been lost in the mill, and they never forgot the stranger who came to town and found her. Silas Cade remains a reluctant hero in the history of Oakhaven. He declined all requests for interviews and books about his experience. He just wanted to live a quiet life and do his job without any supernatural interference. But he knows that he will always be the man who answered the dead phone. And he knows that he will never look at an abandoned building the same way again. The world is full of silence, but sometimes the silence speaks if you listen. And sometimes the most important calls are the ones that come from nowhere. The severed wire on the desk was the only physical proof that the call was impossible, but the body in the basement was the proof that the call was real. It is a paradox that Silas accepted as a part of his life story. He learned to live with the unexplainable and to trust his instincts above all else. If he had ignored the phone or assumed it was a prank, Lena might never have been found. Her killer might have lived out his days as a free man without ever facing justice. It was a terrifying thought, but it validated his decision to answer the ring. He had walked into the darkness and brought the truth back out into the light. And that was something that he could be proud of in the end. The rain still falls in Oak Haven and the fog still rolls in from the coast, but the mill is gone and the phone is silent in the evidence locker. The story is over, but the lesson remains for anyone who hears it. Never ignore the signs that the universe sends you, even if they seem impossible, and be careful when you explore the places that have been left behind. You never know who might be waiting for you to pick up the line. The connection between the living and the dead is thinner than we think, and sometimes all it takes is a ringing phone to bridge the gap. The final footage recovered from a rural highway. The digital clock on the dashboard flickered with a pale green light that read 3 in the morning. Victor Hale rubbed his tired eyes and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of his sedan. He had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight across the desolate plains of western Nevada that night. Victor was a 24-year-old freelance photographer who was moving his life to the coast for work. He had packed everything he owned into the back of his silver Honda and hit the road solo. The only company he had for the long drive was the static of the radio and his dash cam. He had installed the camera just days before the trip at the insistence of his worried mother. She had read too many stories about accidents on these rural highways and wanted him to be safe. Victor thought she was being paranoid, but he agreed to run the camera to give her some peace. The device was suctioned to the glass and recorded a continuous loop of the dark road stretching ahead. The headlights cut through the pitch-black darkness and illuminated the dry brush and the occasional mile marker. The road he had chosen was State Route 50, which was often called the loneliest road in America. There were stretches of this highway where a driver could go hours without seeing another set of headlights. Victor had stopped for gas at a small station near the Utah border about 2 hours ago. The attendant had been a quiet man who stared at the packed car with a strange intensity. Victor had pumped his gas quickly and bought a bottle of water before getting back on the road. He shook off the memory of the strange man and focused on the white lines passing under his tires. The hypnotic rhythm of the road was making his eyelids heavy, and he knew he needed to stop soon. He spotted a gravel turnout ahead that looked wide enough for him to park and rest for a while. Victor slowed the car down and pulled off the pavement onto the crunching gravel of the shoulder. He put the car in park and left the engine running for a moment to let the heater work. The dashcam continued to record the view of the dark scrubland illuminated by the high beams of the car. Victor turned off the headlights to save the battery and plunged the world into sudden and total darkness. The camera switched to night vision mode and bathed the screen in a grainy green and black hue. Victor reclined his seat and locked the doors before closing his eyes to catch some much-needed sleep. The silence of the desert was absolute outside the thin metal shell of his packed vehicle. The video file that would later become crucial evidence showed nothing but the dark horizon for nearly an hour. The timestamp in the corner of the frame ticked by slowly as Victor slept peacefully in the driver's seat. Then, at 4:15 in the morning, the microphone picked up the sound of crunching gravel outside. It was a slow and rhythmic sound like heavy boots walking carefully toward the rear of the vehicle. The camera was facing forward, so the source of the noise was not visible in the frame yet. Victor shifted in his sleep and mumbled something unintelligible, but he did not wake up to the noise. The footsteps stopped near the trunk of the car and were replaced by a soft metallic clicking sound. It sounded like someone was trying the handle of the trunk to see if it was locked tight. The noise continued for several seconds before the footsteps resumed and moved along the passenger side of the car. A shadow passed briefly over the hood of the car and blocked out the stars for a second. The figure moved to the front of the vehicle and finally stepped into the field of view of the camera. It was a man wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up to obscure his face completely. He stood directly in front of the car and stared through the windshield at the sleeping form of Victor. The night vision mode of the camera captured the reflection of eyes that looked cold and very calculated. The man stood there for a full minute without moving and just watched Victor sleep in the isolated car. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that looked like a jagged rock. The man stepped around to the driver's side door and out of the view of the camera lens. There was a sudden loud smash as the side window was shattered and the glass rained down on Victor. Victor screamed in terror and the audio picked up the sounds of a violent struggle inside the car. The camera was knocked loose from the windshield during the fight and fell onto the passenger floor mat. The lens was now pointing up at the underside of the dashboard, and the view was mostly obscured by darkness. The audio continued to record the terrifying sounds of the confrontation that was happening just inches away. There was a voice demanding the keys and the wallet, followed by the sound of a heavy blow. Victor was pleading with the attacker and telling him to just take the car and let him go. The car door was thrown open and the sound of Victor being dragged out onto the gravel was audible. The recording captured the sound of the engine being revved hard as the attacker jumped into the driver's seat. The car peeled out of the gravel turnout and back onto the highway, leaving Victor behind in the dark. The camera slid across the floor as the car accelerated and finally came to rest, wedged under the seat. It continued to record the muffled sound of the road noise and the radio for another 2 hours. The car was eventually parked and the engine was turned off, which ended the power supply to the camera. The vehicle was found 3 years later in a ravine about 50 miles south of the original turnout. A group of hikers had spotted the glint of metal in the brush and called the local authorities. The car had been stripped of its tires and engine parts, but the interior was largely intact. Detective Vance Miller was assigned to the case and arrived at the scene to oversee the recovery operation. He had been the officer who took the missing person report for Victor Hale back in 2014. The car was hauled up from the ravine and transported to the police impound lot for a forensic search. Detective Miller searched the vehicle himself and found the dash cam wedged deep under the passenger seat mechanism. The device was dusty and the plastic casing was cracked, but the memory card inside looked undamaged. He carefully removed the small SD card and placed it into an evidence bag with a sense of hope. This tiny piece of plastic might finally hold the answers to what happened to the young photographer. The card was sent to the State Digital Forensics Lab, where technicians worked to recover the data files. The battery had died long ago, and the heat of the desert could have corrupted the sensitive data. It took 2 weeks for the lab to reconstruct the video files and send them back to Miller. He sat at his desk with a cup of coffee and prepared himself to watch the final moments. The video played clearly on his monitor and showed the drive and the stop at the gas station. Miller watched the interaction at the gas station closely and noted the appearance of the attendant on duty. He then watched as Victor pulled over to sleep and the terrifying sequence of the attack played out. The face of the attacker was visible in the night vision for that 1 minute he stood there. Miller paused the video and zoomed in on the face of the man in the dark hoodie. The resolution was grainy, but there was a distinctive scar visible on the chin of the attacker. Miller recognized the scar immediately because he had interviewed a man with that same mark years ago. The man was a local drifter named Caleb Reed, who had been a suspect in several burglaries nearby. Reed had always had an alibi for the nights in question, and the police could never pin anything on him. But this video placed him directly at the scene of the abduction with clear intent to harm. Miller printed the still image of the face and issued an immediate warrant for the arrest of Reed. A tactical team was assembled to raid the trailer where Reed was known to stay in the desert. They moved in at dawn and found Reed asleep in his bed, much like Victor had been that night. He was taken into custody without a fight and brought to the interrogation room at the county station. Miller walked into the room and placed the photo from the video on the table in front of Reed. The color drained from the face of the suspect as he realized that his crime had been recorded. Reed confessed to the carjacking and the assault, but he claimed that he had left Victor alive on the road. He said that Victor had run off into the desert after the car was taken, and he never saw him again. Miller did not believe the story and pressed Reed for the location of the body of the victim. Reed finally broke down and admitted that he had panicked and returned to the scene to silence the witness. He gave the police specific coordinates to a shallow grave located a few miles from the turnout. The recovery team went to the site and found the skeletal remains of Victor Hale buried under the sand. The discovery brought a tragic sense of closure to the family who had waited 3 years for answers. The footage from the dashcam was the key piece of evidence that secured a conviction for first-degree murder. Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his brutal crimes that night. The case of the missing photographer was finally closed, but the footage remained a haunting piece of evidence. The dashcam video was never released to the public out of respect for the family of the victim, but the description of the footage circulated among law enforcement officers as a warning about the dangers of the road. It served as a reminder that safety is an illusion when you are alone in the vast, empty wilderness. Detective Miller kept a copy of the case file on his desk for years after the trial ended. He often looked at the photo of the young man who had just wanted to move to the coast. The tragic irony was that the camera Victor thought was useless had been the only witness to speak for him. It had waited patiently in the dark under the seat for 3 years to tell the truth. The technology had survived the elements and the passage of time to ensure that justice was finally served. It was a testament to the fact that nothing stays buried forever in the desert if you look hard enough. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even if it takes years to find the light of day. There was one detail in the video that bothered Detective Miller long after the case was officially closed. In the audio recording of the drive before the stop, he heard Victor talking on the phone. Victor was telling his mother that he felt like he was being followed by a truck with one headlight. He said the truck had been behind him for 50 miles and would slow down whenever he slowed down. Miller went back and watched the footage from the rear camera, which he had initially ignored during the investigation. The rear camera showed a pair of headlights in the distance that stayed at a constant distance for hours. One of the headlights was dimmer than the other, just as Victor had described to his mother on the call. When Victor pulled over into the turnout, the headlights of the truck passed by and continued down the road. But the taillights of the truck flared red as it braked hard about a quarter-mile down the highway. The truck then reversed slowly along the shoulder with its lights off until it was near the turnout. This revealed that Caleb Reed had not just stumbled upon a sleeping victim by random chance that night. He had been stalking Victor for over an hour and waiting for the perfect moment to strike him. The realization made the crime feel even more predatory and cold-blooded than Miller had originally thought possible. It meant that Reed was hunting on that highway and looking for anyone who appeared vulnerable and alone. The road was the perfect hunting ground for a predator who knew the terrain well. Miller used this new information to look into other missing person cases along that same stretch of Route 50. He found 2 other reports of travelers who had vanished in that area between 2010 and 14. Both vehicles had been found abandoned with no sign of the drivers and no clues to follow. Miller theorized that Reed might be responsible for those disappearances as well, based on the modus operandi. He went back to the prison to interview Reed again about the other missing people on the list. Reed refused to speak about any other crimes and maintained his silence until the day he died in prison. But the timeline and the location strongly suggested that he was a serial offender operating in the shadows. The dashcam footage had stopped him before he could claim any more victims on that dark stretch of road. It was a small comfort to the families of the potential victims who were spared by his arrest. The legacy of Victor Hale became one of saving others through the silent testimony of his camera. The story of the recovered footage became a local legend in the small towns along the highway border. People warned travelers not to stop in the remote turnouts and to keep moving until they reached a town. The gas station where Victor had stopped eventually closed down, and the building fell into disrepair and ruin. The attendant who had stared at Victor was interviewed but cleared of any involvement in the actual crime. He claimed he had just been admiring the car and wondered why a city boy was out there. Detective Miller retired a few years later and moved to a house near a lake to fish and relax. He tried to leave the darkness of the job behind him, but some cases stick with you forever. He never drove on Route 50 again, and he always advised his grandchildren to fly instead of drive. The image of the man standing in the dark watching Victor sleep haunted his dreams occasionally at night. It was the ultimate violation of safety and privacy that made the crime so terrifying to contemplate. The footage was a digital ghost story that was all the more frightening because it was completely true. It showed how quickly a life can be taken and how fragile our sense of security really is. The desert reclaimed the spot where Victor had died, and the wind erased the tire tracks in the gravel, but the digital file remained locked away in an evidence locker as a permanent record of the event. It was the final footage recovered from a rural highway, and it changed everything for those involved. The memory card is still there today, sitting in a plastic bag labeled with the case number and date. It contains the last sunset that Victor ever saw, and the face of the man who took his life. It is a small piece of plastic that holds a massive amount of tragedy and truth within its circuits. And it serves as a silent warning to anyone who thinks that they are truly alone on the road. You never know who might be watching from the darkness just beyond the reach of your headlights. Miller sometimes wondered if Victor had sensed the danger before he fell asleep in the car that night. The phone call to his mother suggested that his instincts were screaming at him to keep moving. If he had just driven another hour, he would have reached a town with a motel and safety. It was a series of small decisions that led to a catastrophic outcome that could not be undone. That is the nature of tragedy and the burden of hindsight that the living must carry for the dead. The case was featured in a documentary about highway crimes and the importance of dashcam evidence in investigations. The producers asked to use the actual footage, but the family and Miller refused the request firmly. They did not want the death of Victor to be used for entertainment or shock value on television. The story was told through reenactments and interviews, which was powerful enough to convey the horror. The message was clear that technology can be a powerful tool for justice in the modern world. The documentary ended with a shot of the highway stretching out into the endless horizon at sunset. It was a beautiful and deadly landscape that held countless secrets in its vast open spaces. The viewer was left with a feeling of unease and a newfound respect for the dangers of travel. And somewhere in a cold evidence room, the real footage sat in the dark, waiting to be forgotten. But the story of Victor Hale would ensure that the lesson was remembered for a long time. The final report on the case concluded that the recovery of the camera was a 1 in a million chance. If the hikers had not strayed off the trail, they would never have seen the wreck in the brush. The car would have rusted away into nothing, and the truth would have vanished along with it. It was a stroke of luck that brought peace to a grieving family and justice to a killer. It was the final act of a young man who just wanted to document his journey to a new life. And in a way, he did document his journey, but it was not the one he had intended to take. He documented the end of his path and left a map for others to find him in the dark. That was the power of the final footage recovered from a rural highway on that fateful day. It was a story of light and shadow and the thin line that separates the two in our lives. And it was a story that would be whispered on the wind of the high desert for generations. This ordinary map led investigators to a warning. The rain was coming down in sheets against the large front window of the antique shop in downtown Seattle. Julian West wiped his dusty hands on a cotton rag and looked at the massive oak desk before him. He had purchased the heavy piece of furniture at an estate sale earlier that morning for a very low price. The previous owner had been a man named Arthur Vance, who had lived a quiet and solitary life in Bellevue. Vance had passed away recently, and his distant relatives were eager to clear out his cluttered house quickly. Julian specialized in restoring vintage furniture, and he knew that this desk was a true diamond in the rough. He began the restoration process by pulling out the heavy wooden drawers to inspect the joinery and the rails. The desk was solid oak and smelled of lemon polish and the stale smoke of old pipe tobacco. Julian removed the bottom drawer on the left side and noticed something strange about the depth of the cavity. The drawer seemed to be shorter than the space it occupied, which suggested a hidden compartment in the back. He reached his arm into the dark opening and felt a small wooden latch located near the rear panel. Julian pressed the latch and heard a soft click as a secret panel popped open in the wood. He pulled the panel free and reached inside to retrieve a folded piece of thick and yellowed paper. It was a standard topographic map of the Cascade foothills that had been printed in 1995. Julian unfolded the map on the surface of the desk and turned on his bright inspection lamp to see. The map depicted a dense area of forest that was located about 40 miles east of the city limits. There were red ink markings drawn over the contour lines that indicated a specific path leaving the main trail. The path wound through a steep valley and ended at a location marked with a small black skull symbol. Julian leaned in closer and saw that someone had written a message in the margin of the map. The handwriting was jagged and pressed hard into the paper as if the writer was angry or afraid. The message simply read that this ordinary map led to a warning that must never be ignored. Julian felt a chill run down his spine as he traced the red line with his finger on the paper. He wondered if this was just a game or a fantasy map created by a bored old man. But the serious tone of the writing and the hidden nature of the map suggested something much darker. He decided to do some research on the area marked by the skull to see if it held significance. He searched online for news stories related to that specific patch of wilderness in the last 20 years. The search results showed that 3 hikers had gone missing in that exact area between 1990 and 2000. Their bodies had never been found, and the cases had eventually gone cold due to a lack of evidence. Julian stared at the screen and realized that the map might be the key to solving those disappearances. He knew he should call the police immediately, but he felt a strange compulsion to see the location himself. He wanted to verify that the path on the map actually existed before he involved the local authorities. He waited until the rain stopped the following morning and packed his hiking gear into his old truck. Julian drove out to the trailhead marked on the map and parked his vehicle in the empty gravel lot. The forest was silent and dripping with water as he stepped onto the muddy trail with the map in hand. He walked for an hour along the marked public path until he reached the point where the red line diverged. There was no visible trail leading into the dense undergrowth where the red ink line indicated he should go. Julian pushed through the wet ferns and the low-hanging branches of the pine trees to follow the route. The terrain was steep and difficult to navigate, but he found faint signs that someone had walked here before. There were old blaze marks cut into the bark of the trees that had weathered over many years. He checked his compass and the map constantly to ensure that he was staying on the course marked in red. The woods felt oppressive and dark as he descended into the deep valley shown on the paper. He eventually reached a small clearing that was surrounded by towering rock walls on 3 sides of the perimeter. In the center of the clearing stood a solitary oak tree that looked dead and twisted by the elements. Julian walked toward the tree and saw that something was carved deeply into the gray wood of the trunk. He brushed away the moss and saw the same black skull symbol that was drawn on the map. Beneath the skull was an arrow pointing directly at a large pile of rocks at the base. Julian approached the rocks cautiously and used a sturdy stick to pry the top stones away from the pile. He uncovered a heavy metal ammunition box that had been buried in the earth to protect it from weather. The box was rusted shut, but the seal appeared to remain intact despite the years it had been there. He used a rock to hammer the latch open and lifted the heavy lid with a loud metallic creak. Inside the box was a collection of items that made his stomach turn and his hands shake uncontrollably. There were 3 driver licenses belonging to the missing hikers and a small leather journal filled with handwriting. On top of the items was a single index card with the word warning written in bold black letters. Julian picked up the card and read the text that was written on the back in the same jagged script. It said that this was the trophy box of a monster who had hunted in these woods for decades. The writer claimed to be the brother of the killer who had discovered the truth too late to stop him. The note explained that the brother had buried the evidence here because he was too afraid to go to police. He feared that his brother would kill him and his family if he ever found out about the betrayal. So he had left the map in his desk and hoped that someone would find it after they were both dead. Julian realized that Arthur Vance was the brother who had written the note and hidden the map away. The killer was likely someone close to Arthur who might still be alive and free in the world today. Julian closed the box and grabbed his phone to call the police, but there was no signal in the valley. He shoved the heavy metal box into his backpack and began the long hike back to his truck immediately. He felt like eyes were watching him from the trees as he scrambled up the steep slope of the valley. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sounded like footsteps following him through the dense and dark forest that afternoon. He reached his truck breathless and terrified and drove straight to the county sheriff's station to report the find. Sheriff Hagen listened to the story with a skeptical expression until Julian placed the licenses on the desk. The mood in the room changed instantly as the sheriff recognized the names of the missing people from the files. He called for detectives to secure the evidence and interview Julian about the exact location of the hidden box. They opened the journal and began to read the horrific details of the crimes that were recorded inside the pages. The journal belonged to a man named Silas Vance, who was the older brother of the late Arthur Vance. Silas Vance had been a respected member of the community and a former park ranger in that very district. He had used his knowledge of the woods to hunt his victims and hide their bodies where no one looked. The police launched a massive manhunt for Silas, who was now living in a retirement home near the coast. They arrested him that evening as he sat in the common room watching television without a care in the world. The evidence in the box was overwhelming, and Silas eventually confessed to the murders during the long interrogation. He admitted to killing the 3 hikers and burying their bodies in a location that was also in the journal. The police used the information to recover the remains and finally bring closure to the grieving families after 20 years. The town was shocked to learn that the friendly old ranger had been a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Julian was hailed as a hero for finding the map and bringing the truth to light after so long. But he could not shake the feeling of dread that the warning note had instilled in him that day. He thought about Arthur Vance living with that terrible secret for all those years in his quiet house. Arthur had been too cowardly to stop his brother, but he had left a breadcrumb trail for someone else. Julian went back to the shop and looked at the desk that had started the entire chain of events. He felt a strange connection to Arthur and a sadness for the burden the man had carried alone. He decided to keep the desk as a reminder that secrets always have a way of surfacing eventually. The police investigation revealed that Silas had suspected his brother knew about the crimes but never confronted him directly. The 2 brothers had played a silent game of cat and mouse for decades until they both grew old. The map was Arthur's final move in the game, and it was the one that finally checkmated his brother. The warning on the map was not just about the danger in the woods, but about the danger of silence. It was a warning that evil can thrive when good people are too afraid to speak the truth aloud. Julian eventually sold the antique shop and moved to a different city to start a new life away from there. He wanted to escape the memories of the rain and the dark woods and the heavy oak desk. But he kept the map in a frame on his wall as a testament to the strange twist of fate. It was an ordinary map that looked like any other piece of paper you might find in a glove box. Yet it had led investigators to a warning that solved 3 murders and caught a monster in the end. The case became a legend in the Pacific Northwest and was studied by criminal profilers for many years. They analyzed the relationship between the brothers and the psychology of keeping such a dark secret for so long. The story served as a grim reminder that you never really know what is hiding in the hearts of others. Even the people closest to you can harbor darkness that is unimaginable until the truth is finally revealed. Julian often thought about the moment he found the false bottom in the drawer of that old desk. It was a simple mechanical latch that separated the mundane world from a nightmare of violence and death. If he had not been so thorough in his restoration work, the map might have stayed hidden forever. The box in the woods would have rusted away, and the victims would have remained lost in the earth. It was a chilling thought that reinforced his belief that everything happens for a reason in this life. The ordinary map was not ordinary at all, but a key that unlocked a door to the past. The warning note was filed away in the police evidence locker along with the rusted metal ammunition box, but the words on the card remained burned into the mind of Julian West for the rest of his life. He learned to trust his instincts and to never ignore the small details that seem out of place, because sometimes the smallest thing, like a scratch on a drawer or a line on a map, changes everything. The world is full of hidden maps leading to warnings if you are brave enough to follow the path. Years later, Julian received a letter from the mother of one of the victims who had been found. She thanked him for giving her a place to mourn and for ending the uncertainty that had plagued her life. She enclosed a small photo of her daughter smiling on a hiking trail just days before she vanished. Julian placed the photo next to the map on his wall and finally felt a sense of peace about it. The darkness of the crime had been balanced by the light of the truth that he had uncovered. He realized that Arthur Vance had been a victim in his own way of the fear that controlled him. By finding the map, Julian had not only solved the murders, but he had also freed Arthur from his guilt. It was a complex web of tragedy and redemption that had spanned 2 generations of the Vance family, and it all began with a rainy afternoon and a dusty old desk in an antique shop in Seattle. The map was just paper and ink, but it held the weight of human lives within its folded creases. The warning was clear to anyone who heard the story of the discovery in the deep, dark woods. Do not keep secrets that act as poison to the soul, and do not let fear silence your voice. The truth demands to be heard, and it will find a way to escape even the deepest burial. Julian West was just the messenger who carried the warning from the dead to the living world. And in doing so, he changed the history of a small town and brought justice to those who deserved it. The story of the map and the warning is still told by the locals in the shadow of the mountains. They warn hikers to stay on the marked trails and to never follow red lines into the unknown, because you never know what you might find buried at the base of a dead oak tree in the valley, and some warnings are written in blood and fear that can never be washed away by the rain. It is a legacy that Julian West left behind without ever intending to become a part of the story. But that is how life works sometimes. When you stumble upon the secrets of the past in an old desk, you become a character in a narrative that was written long before you were born into the world. And the only choice you have is to follow the map and see where the winding path leads you. For Julian, it led to a warning that saved him from a life of ignorance and opened his eyes. And for the victims, it led to a final resting place where they could sleep in peace at last. The ordinary map remains one of the most significant pieces of evidence ever recovered in that county. It is a silent witness to the evil that men do and the guilt that eventually consumes them whole. And it is a reminder that even in the digital age, a piece of paper can still hold power. The power to warn and the power to heal and the power to bring the truth to light. That is the story of the map that led investigators to a warning in the deep woods. Julian often wondered if Silas ever knew that his brother had betrayed him in the end with that map. The look on the old man's face when the police showed him the journal suggested that he did know. It was a look of betrayal and shock that his own blood had turned against him from beyond the grave. The game was over, and the pieces had been swept from the board by the hand of fate. And all because of an ordinary map that was hidden away in the dark for 20 years. The rain still falls on the streets of Seattle, and the antique shops still sell old furniture to strangers, but Julian never bought another desk without checking every inch of it for hidden compartments first. He knew that lightning rarely strikes twice, but he was not willing to take that chance again. One warning was enough for a lifetime, and he had no desire to find another one in the dark. He was content to live a simple life with his secrets out in the open where they belonged. And the map hung on his wall as a silent guardian against the shadows that linger in the corners. A reminder that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone who is looking for it. It was the final chapter of a story that began with a map and ended with a warning, and it was a story that Julian West would carry with him until the end of his own days. The mystery of the woods was solved, but the mystery of human nature would always remain a puzzle. That is the burden of knowing the truth about what happened in the Valley of the Dead Oak Tree, and it is the burden that Julian accepted when he opened that hidden drawer on that rainy Saturday morning. The ordinary map had changed his life and the lives of many others in ways he could not predict. It was a powerful lesson in the importance of curiosity and the courage to do the right thing. And it was a warning that some maps are better left unfollowed if you are not ready for the destination. But Julian had been ready, and he had followed the line to the bitter end of the road, and because of him, the warning was heard, and the monster was caged, and the lost were found. It was a good ending to a dark story that had haunted the woods for far too long, and it was all thanks to an ordinary map that refused to let the past stay buried in the ground. The antique desk that started it all eventually ended up in a museum display about the strange case. Visitors would stare at the secret compartment and marvel at the simplicity of the hiding place. It was a physical link to a past that was filled with danger and secrets and hidden truths. Julian visited the museum once and stood in front of the desk with a quiet sense of pride. He had done his part to write the ending of the story that Arthur Vance had started. And as he walked out of the museum and into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The map was no longer a burden, but a symbol of the light that dispels the darkness. He walked down the busy street and disappeared into the crowd of people going about their daily lives. But he walked a little lighter and a little taller than he had before he found the map. The warning had been heeded, and the danger had passed, and the world was a safer place. It is strange how a single object can change the trajectory of so many lives in an instant. A map found in a drawer can lead to a grave found in the woods and a killer found in a home. It connects the past to the present in a way that nothing else can really do, and it serves as a reminder that we are all connected by the stories that we leave behind. The story of Julian West and the ordinary map is one that will be told for a long time, because it is a story that proves that even the most ordinary things can be extraordinary, and it proves that the truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. Julian never forgot the smell of the old desk or the sound of the secret latch clicking open. Those were the sensory details of the moment that his life changed forever in that quiet shop. And they were the details that he would remember every time he looked at a map for the rest of his life. Why locals avoid this forest clearing at night. Silas Vance pulled his white pickup truck onto the gravel shoulder of the old logging road during a humid morning. He was a professional land surveyor who had spent over 20 years working in the dense forests of the Northwest. The timber company hired him to mark the boundary lines of a new plot before the heavy machinery arrived there. Silas grabbed his heavy canvas backpack, which contained his expensive laser levels and several boxes of bright orange marking flags. The morning sun was already beginning to bake the pine needles on the ground, and the air felt very thick. He checked his topographical maps one last time before he stepped over a fallen cedar log and entered the brush. The air was unusually still, and the local birds were not singing as he hiked into the dark green woods. Silas spent several hours navigating the rugged terrain and hammering wooden stakes into the damp and soft forest floor soil. Around noon, he pushed through a thicket of hemlock trees and stumbled into a perfectly circular opening in the woods. The grass inside the clearing was completely yellow and brittle, despite the recent heavy rains that had soaked the region. Silas checked his global positioning system and noticed the handheld device was failing to lock onto any available satellite signals. He stepped into the center of the circle and felt a sudden wave of nausea that made him feel lightheaded. The surveyor looked at his compass and watched as the needle began to spin slowly in a clockwise direction today. He decided to take a break and sat on a mossy log while he looked for any signs of wildlife. There were no insect tracks in the dust and no squirrel chatter coming from the surrounding canopy of the trees. Silas noticed a rusted metal object poking out from the dirt near the very edge of the yellow dead grass. He dug it out with his trowel and found a vintage mechanical wristwatch with a cracked face and leather strap. The hands of the watch were permanently frozen at exactly 3:15, and the back was engraved with a name. Silas felt a strange vibration in his chest that seemed to grow stronger the longer he stayed inside that clearing. He gathered his equipment and hiked back to his truck because the feeling of being watched was becoming truly unbearable. That evening, he visited a local diner and asked the waitress about the history of the woods near the ridge. She told him that the area was known as the Dead Patch, and hikers had been disappearing there since forever. Public records showed that a man named Alistair Thorne had vanished while he was hunting for rare mountain orchids there. The search party found his backpack and his rifle leaning against a tree near the center of that same clearing. Witness statements from the volunteers mentioned a low humming sound that caused their ears to bleed and their vision blur. Silas realized that the name on the back of the rusted watch he found matched the missing hiker from archives. He contacted a retired sheriff named Sterling Gable, who had led the original search efforts for the missing orchid hunter. Sterling was 72 years old and lived in a small cabin filled with old topographical maps and handwritten journals. The old man explained that the clearing sat directly above a series of deep and prehistoric limestone caverns and rivers. He believed that the unique shape of the mountains acted like a massive acoustic chamber for the wind during the night. Silas returned to the clearing 2 days later with a professional audio recorder and a high-frequency microphone for data. He set up his equipment on a tripod and waited for the sun to drop below the jagged mountain peaks. As the temperature fell, the wind began to whistle through the narrow canyons and the air started to vibrate heavily. The recorder showed a massive spike in infrasound, which is a frequency that is too low for human ears. Scientific studies have shown that infrasound at high volumes can cause intense feelings of dread and even vivid visual hallucinations. Silas watched the monitor and saw the waves of sound bouncing off the limestone walls hidden beneath his feet today. The vibration became so intense that the yellow grass seemed to dance and the trees appeared to bend and twist. He saw a shadow move across the clearing, and for a moment he thought a man was standing by trees. Silas reminded himself that his brain was reacting to the physical pressure of the sound waves hitting his inner ears. He grabbed his gear and scrambled back toward the trail while the low hum echoed through the bones of skull. The data he collected confirmed that the clearing was a natural trap for sound that created a sense of terror. Locals avoid the area because their ancestors learned that the woods could play tricks on a person who stayed late. The mystery was not a ghost or a monster, but a physical phenomenon that turned the wind into a weapon. Silas submitted his report to the logging company and recommended they leave that specific section of the forest completely alone. He kept the rusted watch in his desk drawer as a reminder that some places are better left to shadows. Logic can explain why the clearing feels wrong, but it cannot stop the cold shiver that runs down your spine. The forest remains silent during the day, while the wind waits for the night to turn the trees into choir. Silas never went back to the northern Cascades, and he took a job surveying coastal properties where the air felt. He still wakes up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking he can hear that low and steady sound. Most people need a reason to be afraid, but Silas knew that nature does not need a reason to be. He looked at the map one last time and saw that the clearing was still marked as a void space. The company decided to build a fence around the perimeter to keep the hikers from wandering into the dangerous sound. Sterling Gable called Silas a week later to tell him that another hiker had reportedly been seen near the ridge. The dispatch logs from the local station mentioned a man who looked disoriented and was wandering in circles near the plining. Silas knew that the mountain was calling to those who were sensitive to the deep and low vibrations of Earth. He looked at the watch on his desk and saw that the hands were now moving backward at high speed. The mechanical parts should not have been working after 30 years in the dirt, but they were spinning very fast. Silas realized that the energy from the clearing had followed him home and was now affecting his personal living space. He drove to a nearby bridge and threw the watch into the deep water so he could find some peace. The ripples in the water reminded him of the sound waves he saw on his digital recorder back in Forest. Nature has a way of reclaiming what belongs to it, and some things are meant to stay lost in dirt. The clearing is still there, and the wind still hums through the limestone caves when the moon is high. Silas sat in his office and wrote a long letter to the Forest Service about the dangers of the infrasound. He explained that the yellow grass was a biological reaction to the constant high-pressure vibrations from the underground caverns. The chemicals in the soil were being altered by the sound waves, which made it impossible for healthy plants to grow. He cited several archived reports from 1952 where a group of loggers abandoned their equipment in that clearing. They reported seeing impossible things and hearing voices that sounded like their own mothers calling them from the deep woods. One logger had reportedly walked into the trees and was never seen again by his coworkers or the local police. Silas felt a sense of duty to document everything he had discovered for the sake of future hikers and families. He spent several weeks organizing his photographs of the yellow grass and the readings from his digital sound recording device. The timber company was not happy with his report because it meant they would lose thousands of dollars in potential. They tried to hire a second surveyor to disprove the findings of Silas, but no one else would take job. Rumors began to circulate in the small town that Silas had been cursed by the spirits of the dead patch. He ignored the gossip and focused on his new work near the ocean, where the waves provided a different sound. The retired sheriff Sterling Gable visited him one afternoon to share a new discovery from the old county historical archives. They found a map from 1875 that showed the clearing was used as a site for ancient rituals. The native people of the area had recognized the power of the sound long before the first settlers had arrived. They called it the place where the earth speaks, and they only visited the clearing during these summer solstice events. Sterling believed that the limestone caverns were much larger than the modern maps had originally indicated to the public. He suspected that the underground river system was connected to a massive lake hidden deep beneath the mountain range itself. Silas looked at the old maps and realized that the vibrations were actually a form of natural sonar for the Freet. The sound was bouncing off the hidden water and creating a feedback loop that resonated with the frequency of fear. He felt a sense of relief knowing that there was a logical explanation for the things he had witnessed there. However, he still could not explain why the watch hands had started to move after he brought it home. He wondered if the metal of the watch had become magnetized by the intense energy of the limestone cavern system. Silas decided to stop looking for answers and focus on the quiet life he had built for himself by sea. He still keeps a copy of the final report in his safe to ensure the truth is never forgotten. The forest clearing remains a dark spot on the map where the wind continues to play its haunting and low. People still talk about the man who went into the woods and came back with a look of pure. They say that if you stand in the center of the yellow grass, you can hear the mountain breathing deep. Silas knows that the mountain is not breathing, but it is certainly alive with the energy of the ancient. He hopes that the fence remains standing and that no one else has to feel the vibration in their. The world is full of places that we do not understand, and some of them are best left alone. Silas Vance is now 70 years old, and he still avoids the woods whenever the wind begins to blow. He tells his grandchildren that the most dangerous things in this world are often the things that we cannot. The legacy of the dead patch lives on in the stories told by the locals around the warm campfires. They warn the tourists to stay on the marked trails and never to enter a circle of yellow grass. The mountain continues to hum and the limestone caves continue to echo with the sound of the invisible wind. Nature does not need to hide its secrets because most people are too afraid to look for them in. Silas closed his journal and looked out at the ocean while the sun began to set over the blue. The sound of the waves was peaceful, and it drowned out the memory of the humming in the dark. He was finally at peace with the mystery of the clearing and the man who was lost in. The watch was gone, and the report was filed, and the forest was a long way from his home. He knew that the clearing would always be there, waiting for the next person to wander into the quote. Why locals avoid this forest clearing at night is a question with a very long and very loud answer. The truth is found in the silence that follows the hum and the shadows that move without any feet. Silas Vance lived a long life, but he never forgot the day the earth spoke to him in woods. He died in 2045 with a smile on his face and a map in his hand. His family found a small note tucked inside his favorite book that mentioned the frequency of the ancient earth. It said that the world is a symphony, and we are only hearing the smallest part of the song. The clearing is still there, and the grass is still yellow, and the wind is still calling out. The most unsettling emergency calls from one winter. The job of a 911 dispatcher is often described as hours of total boredom interrupted by minutes of terror. Julian Vance was a 36-year-old man who had spent 12 years working the night shift in Washington. He liked the quiet of the late hours when the only sounds were the hum of the servers and wind. The winter of 2009 was the coldest season that the residents of the valley had seen in many decades. Heavy snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and most of the mountain roads were now completely blocked by drifts. Julian sat in the dim light of the dispatch center while the snow piled up against the small frosted windows. He drank a cup of lukewarm coffee and watched the green lights on the console flash as the systems ran tests. Most of the calls that night had been about fallen tree limbs or neighbors complaining about loud snowblowers in town. He expected the rest of his shift to be just as routine and forgettable as the previous 12 years of work. Julian checked the digital clock on the wall and saw that it was exactly 2:45 in the morning right now. A single red light began to blink on the emergency line console, which indicated an incoming priority call from a rural area. Julian adjusted his headset and pressed the button to accept the signal while he prepared his digital notepad for the notes. He heard nothing but the sound of heavy breathing and the faint crackle of static on the other end of line. He asked for the location of the emergency, but the caller remained silent for several long seconds before they finally spoke. A woman with a very shaky voice told him that there was a man standing in her front yard right now. She said that he was wearing a bright red coat and was just staring at her front door in the dark. Julian asked for her address, and she told him that she lived at the end of Old Mill Road near Ridge. He looked at his map and saw that her house was the most isolated property in that entire northern section today. The woman said that the man was not moving even though the wind was blowing at 40 miles per hour. Julian kept the woman on the line while he dispatched a patrol car to the remote location on Old Mill Road. He told her to lock all of her doors and to stay away from the windows until the police arrived there. The woman began to whisper that the man in the red coat was now walking toward her porch very slowly. She described his movements as jerky and unnatural, as if he was struggling to move his heavy limbs in the cold. Julian felt a chill run down his spine, because her voice sounded like she was witnessing something truly impossible that night. He checked the status of the responding officer and saw that the patrol car was still 10 miles away from her. The woman suddenly screamed that the man was standing right outside her living room window and looking directly at her face. Then the line went completely dead, and the only thing Julian could hear was the dial tone in his ear. He tried to call the number back several times, but the system reported that the line was busy or disconnected. 10 minutes later, a second call came into the dispatch center from a completely different part of the valley that night. This caller was a young man who lived in a small cabin near the frozen lake about 5 miles away. He sounded terrified and told Julian that there was a person standing on the ice wearing a bright red winter coat. The young man said the figure had been standing in the exact same spot for over 3 hours in the blizzard. Julian felt his heart begin to race because the description of the man matched the first call perfectly in every way. He asked the caller if he could see the face of the person standing out on the frozen lake right now. The young man said that the figure did not seem to have a face or any visible features under the hood. Julian checked his logs and realized that it was physically impossible for a person to travel that distance so very quickly. The snow was too deep for a vehicle to move, and no person could walk 5 miles in 10 minutes. The patrol officer named Miller finally reached the first house on Old Mill Road and reported his findings over the radio. He said that the front door was wide open and the lights were all flashing on and off inside the house. Miller entered the property with his weapon drawn and searched every room for the woman who had called the dispatch center. He found her cell phone lying on the kitchen floor, but the house was completely empty and showed no sign of struggle. The officer stepped out onto the front porch and noticed a set of footprints in the deep snow near the stairs. He followed the tracks for about 50 yards until they simply stopped in the middle of a wide and open field. There were no return tracks and no evidence that the person had been picked up by a vehicle or a sled. Miller told Julian that the footprints were very deep and looked like they were made by someone who was heavy. The air temperature was 10 degrees below zero, and no one could survive outside without proper shelter for very long. Julian received a third call at 4:15 in the morning from a woman who sounded exactly like the first caller. She said that she was hiding in her basement and that the man in the red coat was in the house. Julian realized that the caller identification display was showing a phone number that had been disconnected back in 1994. He asked the woman how she was calling him, and she said that she was using the old wall phone. The dispatcher felt a wave of nausea as he looked at the records for that specific property on the computer. The archives showed that a woman had disappeared from that exact same house during a blizzard 25 years ago today. She had called 911 to report a man in a red coat before she vanished without a trace then. Julian realized that he was listening to a recording of a call that had happened decades before he was born. The audio quality was too clear for an old recording, and the woman was responding to his specific questions now. The technician on duty, named Sarah, came over to his desk to investigate the strange technical glitch in the phone. She looked at the server logs and confirmed that the signal was coming from an ancient copper line in the woods. Sarah explained that the extreme cold and ice can sometimes cause old electrical signals to become trapped in the wiring. She had heard stories about ghost signals that would replay old conversations when the atmospheric conditions were just right for them. Julian did not believe her because the woman on the line was reacting to the things he was saying today. He asked the woman if she knew what year it was, and she told him it was 1984. She said that the man in the red coat was scratching at the basement door with his long metal fingernails. Julian told her to stay quiet and promised that help was on the way to her location right now. He knew that there was no one left to save because the event had already happened a long time ago. The young man at the lake called back and said the figure on the ice was now standing at door. He was crying and saying that he could hear a low humming sound coming from the man in the red coat. Julian told him to hide in the bathroom and to lock the door while he sent another officer to Lake. The young man said that the humming was getting louder and it felt like his teeth were vibrating in head. He dropped the phone and Julian heard the sound of wood splintering as the front door was forced open violently. There was a sound of heavy boots walking across the floor, and then a deep and distorted voice spoke into phone. The voice said that it was finally time to go back into the cold where the light never shines. Then the line went silent, and Julian was left sitting in the quiet dispatch center while the sun rose. The morning light revealed a world covered in a thick blanket of white snow that looked peaceful and very still. The police arrived at the lake cabin 30 minutes later and found the young man sitting on the kitchen floor. He was completely unharmed, but he was staring at the wall with wide eyes and would not speak to anyone. The officers found a bright red coat lying on the rug in the center of the living room that morning. The coat was soaking wet and smelled like stagnant lake water and old pine needles from the deep forest floor. There were no footprints leading to the cabin, and the snow on the porch was completely undisturbed by any boots. The young man was taken to the hospital for observation, and the doctor said he was in a state shock. He never told anyone what he saw that night, and he moved away from the valley a few weeks later. Julian visited the cabin and saw the red coat before the evidence team took it away for further testing. It was an old style of heavy wool parka that was common in the Northern Territories during the 70s. Julian spent the next few months researching the history of the redcoat figure in the local county library archives. He found dozens of reports dating back to the late 1800s that mentioned a similar presence in the woods. The stories always appeared during the coldest winters when the snow was deep enough to bury the small mountain cabins. Locals called the figure the Winter Watcher, and they believed it was a manifestation of the cold and the dark. The reports usually mentioned a low humming sound and a feeling of intense dread that preceded the arrival of figure. Julian realized that the calls he received were not just glitches or recordings, but a bridge between different points in time. The energy of the storm had allowed the past to bleed into the present through the old copper phone lines. He felt a sense of relief, knowing that he was not crazy and that others had seen the man. Logic could not explain how the same man in the red coat could be in two places at once today. Julian continued to work the night shift, but he never felt the same sense of peace in the quiet hours. He often looked at the red light on the console and wondered if the woman was still hiding there. He wrote a detailed report for the sheriff, but the department decided to keep the details away from the public. They did not want to cause a panic in the small town during an already difficult and very cold season. The red coat was never identified, and the woman from the first call was never found by the search team. Her house remained empty, and the bank eventually took possession of the property after several years of total neglect. People in the valley still talk about the winter of 2009 and the things that were heard. They say that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the low and steady humming. Julian Vance retired from the dispatch center 5 years after the events of that strange and very cold winter night. He moved to the desert where the sun always shines and the ground is never covered in the white snow. He still keeps a copy of the dispatch logs in a safe at his home as a constant reminder. He knows that the cold has a way of holding on to the things that it takes from the living world. The most unsettling emergency calls from that winter were not just about a man in a bright red coat. They were a reminder that the world is much older and much darker than we like to believe it is. Julian still wakes up in the middle of the night thinking he can hear the sound of heavy breathing. He checks his phone and sees that the screen is dark and there are no incoming calls for him now. The memory of the red coat will always stay with him like a cold shiver down his weary spine. Nature does not need a reason to be haunting, and the winter does not need a reason to take life. The valley is still there, and the wind still blows through the old copper wires when the moon is high. Julian Vance is finally at peace with the mystery, because he knows that some things are meant to stay hidden. This old photograph raised serious questions years later. Some images capture a moment in time, but others seem to capture things that should not exist at all. This particular photograph sat inside a dusty frame for decades before anyone actually bothered to look at the finer details. Silas Thorne drove his white truck along the winding coastal roads of northern Oregon early on a Tuesday morning lately. The fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean and covered the massive pine trees in a thick layer of gray. He was heading to an isolated property located deep within the forest to conduct a routine structural and land survey. The Sterling estate had been abandoned for over 20 years after the last owner vanished without leaving any known heirs. Local legends suggested the house was cursed, but Silas only cared about the technical aspects of the old Victorian building. He parked his vehicle on the gravel driveway and grabbed his heavy bag filled with measuring tools and camera gear. The front door creaked loudly when he pushed it open, and the smell of stagnant air hit his nose immediately. Silas was a 38-year-old property inspector who had seen hundreds of abandoned houses during his long career. He spent the first hour mapping the ground floor and taking high-resolution photographs of the damaged support beams below. The house was a masterpiece of 19th century architecture despite the significant decay visible on every single wooden surface there. Silas moved to the second floor where the master bedroom looked out over a wild and overgrown backyard garden area. He noticed a loose section of the floorboards near the built-in wardrobe and decided to check for water damage. As he pulled back the wood, he saw a small rectangle of glossy paper stuck in the dark floor joists. He reached down with his gloved hand and pulled out a Polaroid photograph that appeared remarkably well preserved for its age. The picture showed a man standing in the garden wearing a bright red windbreaker and modern-looking blue denim jeans. Silas turned the photo over and saw the date of September 12, 1994, written in faded black ink. He felt a strange sensation in his chest when he looked closely at the man standing by the stone fountain. The man in the photograph was wearing the exact same model of hiking boots that Silas had purchased last month. These boots were a limited edition release from a company that did not even exist during the 1990s era. He sat on the edge of the dusty bed and stared at the image until his eyes began to ache. The man in the picture had a scar on his left cheek that matched a mark Silas received during childhood. He could not understand how a photograph from 1994 could feature a man wearing clothes from the future. Silas decided to investigate the basement to see if he could find any more clues about the previous owner, Arthur. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, and he had to use his powerful flashlight to see the floor clearly. Reportedly, the local police had searched this basement several times after Arthur Sterling vanished without a single trace back then. He found a stack of old shipping crates filled with documents and personal letters from the late 1980s and 90s. One letter was addressed to a man named Silas, and the handwriting looked suspiciously like his own cursive writing style. The letter spoke of a discovery in the nearby woods and a shimmering light that appeared inside a deep cave. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he read the words written on the yellowed paper. The author of the letter claimed that time was not a straight line, but a circle that repeated every few decades. Silas tucked the letter into his pocket and headed back to his truck to get some fresh air and think. He drove to the local town library to search the newspaper archives for any mention of the Sterling estate mystery. The town was a small coastal community where everyone knew each other and secrets were hard to keep for long. The librarian was an elderly woman who remembered the disappearance of Arthur Sterling during the winter of 1998 clearly. She told Silas that a stranger had been seen wandering the property shortly before the owner went missing for good. The descriptions of the stranger provided by the neighbors matched Silas perfectly, including his height and his very short hairstyle. He searched the microfilm records and found a small article about a man found wandering the woods in 1990. The man claimed to be from the year 2024, and he was carrying a device that glowed blue. Silas reached into his pocket and touched his digital laser measure, which emitted a bright blue light when in use. He knew he had to find the cave mentioned in the letter if he wanted to understand what was happening. He checked the old dispatch logs from the 1990 era to see if there were any other strange reports. The hike into the forest took him past ancient trees that seemed to watch his every move with silent intensity. He followed the coordinates written in the margins of the old letter he found in the dark basement crates earlier. The cave entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that cascaded down a jagged cliff face into a shallow rocky pool. He stepped behind the curtain of water and entered a large cavern that smelled of ozone and damp earth together. In the back of the cave, he saw a backpack that looked identical to the one he currently carried over. He opened the bag and found a wallet containing his own identification cards and a set of modern house keys. There was also a notebook filled with his own handwriting describing the events of the last few hours in detail. Silas felt like he was reading a script for a play that he was already performing in real life. The last entry in the notebook said that the light would return at sunset on this very day in September. Silas looked at his watch and realized the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon of the Western Sea. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor of the cave, and the air started to shimmer like heat. He saw a portal of swirling white light open up against the back wall of the cold and dark cavern. He realized that he was the stranger who would travel back to 1994 to take that garden photograph. The man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was his own future self trapped in the past. He stepped toward the light with a sense of inevitability because he knew he could not change his own fate. According to the archived witness statements, a flash of light was seen in these woods on this exact date. The sensation of passing through the portal was like being pulled through a very small straw for a long second. He tumbled out onto the grass of the Sterling estate and felt the warm air of a late summer afternoon. A man stood at the edge of the porch holding a camera, and he looked surprised to see Silas there. It was Arthur Sterling, and he was much younger than the photos Silas had seen in the local town library. Arthur raised his camera and snapped a picture of Silas standing by the stone fountain in the middle garden. The flash of the camera blinded him for a moment, and he realized the cycle had finally come to end. He spent the rest of his days living in the small town under a different name and avoiding his past. Silas worked as a handyman and kept a low profile to ensure he did not interfere with the timeline. He watched his younger self grow up from a distance and waited for the day the survey would finally begin. The photograph he found as a young man was the key that unlocked the door to his own strange destiny. He understood now that some questions are better left unanswered until the right moment in time arrives for us all. The image of the man in the red jacket remained hidden behind the floorboards for many long and silent years. Silas smiled as he looked at the sunset and realized that he was finally exactly where he was meant to be. The house was no longer a project to be surveyed, but a home where he had lived a secret life. He left a final note in the basement crate for his younger self to find when the time was right. Silas made sure to include the modern boots in the letter so his younger self would recognize the truth. The words on the paper were simple and meant to provide comfort to the man he used to be before. He told himself that the journey through the light was worth the price of leaving his old world far behind. The trees in the yard grew taller every year, and the stone fountain began to crumble under the heavy moss. He spent his evenings sitting on the porch and listening to the sound of the Pacific Ocean in the distance. The mystery of the photograph was finally solved, but the wonder of the experience would stay with him forever now. He was a man who lived twice in the same century and saw the world through two different sets of eyes. The past and the future were no longer separate places, but were parts of the same beautiful and complex design. Silas knew that the photograph was a bridge between the two versions of his own very strange life. Silas Thorne closed his eyes and felt the gentle breeze of the Oregon coast against his weathered and aged face. He was no longer a surveyor searching for answers, but a man who had finally found his place in time. The old photograph was a bridge between two lives that were always meant to cross at the very same point. He knew that the cycle would continue and another young man would soon arrive at the front door with bag. The story was written in the stars and in the silver crystals of the old Polaroid film in the bedroom. He had no regrets about the path he took or the secrets he kept hidden from the rest of the world. Final footage from a nearby security camera reportedly showed a man walking into the woods and never coming back out. Life has a strange way of looping back on itself when we are least prepared for the ultimate truth hidden. The image in the frame was just a reminder that time is not a line, but a very large circle. Silas was happy to be a part of the circle and to know that he was never truly alone. The photograph would be found and the journey would begin again, just as it had happened so many times before. He looked at the red jacket hanging on the hook and knew that his work was finally finished today. The sun set over the ocean, and the house on the hill became a silent witness to the passing years. Every detail was exactly as it should be, and the silence of the forest was the only sound left. Silas Thorne leaned back in his chair and watched the stars appear in the clear and dark night sky. The mystery of the Sterling estate would remain a local legend for the people living in the small coastal town. They would talk about the man who vanished and the stranger who appeared from nowhere on a warm summer day. Silas did not mind being a legend because he knew the truth of his own incredible and long journey. He had traveled across the decades to find himself standing in a garden with a camera and a smile. The world was full of wonders that could not be explained by science or the logic of modern men. He was content to live in the silence of the woods and wait for the circle to complete itself. The old photograph was just the beginning of a story that would never truly have a final and ending. What really happened at this remote boat dock? Some places hold secrets that the dark water tries its very best to wash away into the cold and deep depths. A small wooden structure sitting on the edge of a deep lake can hide the truth for many long years. Gideon Vance was a 48-year-old marine surveyor who specialized in inspecting old piers and isolated boat docks lately. He drove his heavy white truck through the dense pine forests of northern Minnesota on a very humid morning. His goal for the day was to evaluate the structural integrity of a dock at the Old and Blackwood Fishing. The camp had been closed since the year 1984 after a series of strange and unexplained missing persons cases. Gideon stepped out of his vehicle and felt the damp air of the lake press against his face and bear. The dock was a skeletal remain of gray wood that stretched out into the mirror-like surface of the silent. He grabbed his underwater camera and a long metal pole to test the depth of the silt near the old. As he moved toward the end of the dock, he noticed a dark shape resting on the shallow and sandy. He reached down with his specialized reaching tool and pulled a heavy metal box from the thick and black lake. The box was locked with a rusted padlock that looked like it had been submerged for at least 30 long. He used a small pry bar from his toolkit to break the lock and open the lid of the heavy. Inside, he found a waterproof bag containing a notebook and a small camera that used old-fashioned 35mm. The notebook belonged to a man named Silas Thorne, who was a researcher exploring the lake in 1980. Gideon sat on the edge of the dock and began to read the entries written in a very frantic. The researcher claimed that the water levels in the lake would drop suddenly without any logical or natural explanation why. He wrote about a hidden chamber that appeared beneath the dock whenever the water reached a specific low. Gideon looked at the pilings and saw that the water line was much lower than it had been earlier. He noticed a set of iron rings bolted to the side of the main support beam deep under the time. He decided to climb down the slippery rings to investigate the area where the iron led into the lake bed. Reportedly, there were archived calls from local fishermen who saw a man walking onto the dock and never returning back. Gideon found a heavy wooden hatch that was hidden behind a thick layer of green algae and slippery lake. He pulled the handle with all of his strength, and the hatch opened to reveal a dry concrete. The room was filled with old equipment and a small cot that looked like someone had lived there recently. He found a set of binoculars and a logbook that recorded the movements of everyone who visited the fishing. The final entry was dated October 3, 1984, and it described a man standing on the dock alone. The author of the logbook wrote that he was finally ready to step out and confront the visitor from. Gideon realized that the missing persons were actually being watched by a man living right under their very own. The dock was not just a place for boats, but a perfect vantage point for a very patient. He began to search the corners of the concrete room for any evidence of what happened to these silent. He found a stack of developed photographs that showed the dock from several different angles over many different. One photograph showed a young man standing on the pier in the year 1976 with a fishing. Another image captured a woman walking toward the water in the year 1980, and she looked very confused. Gideon noticed that in every single photograph there was a small reflection of someone hiding just beneath the wooden. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the observer had been taking photos for several. There were boxes of canned food and dozens of empty water jugs stacked neatly against the cold and gray. He found a small radio that was still tuned to a local station that had stopped broadcasting many years. The floor of the room was covered in maps of the lake with red circles drawn around the deepest. He picked up a map and saw a note that mentioned a second entrance hidden near the old. Gideon climbed back up to the surface and breathed in the fresh air of the pine forest once. He walked toward the abandoned boathouse, which was a collapsing structure made of rotting cedar and rusted iron. The door was jammed shut by a pile of fallen debris and thick vines that had grown over the fall end. He used his shoulder to shove the door open, and the sound of cracking timber echoed across the quiet. Inside, he found an old wooden rowboat that was filled with more boxes of documents and personal. He found a driver license for a man named Arthur Vance, and he realized the man was his own. Arthur had vanished in 1984, and the family had always assumed that he had simply run away. Gideon held the plastic card in his hand and felt a deep sense of shock and sadness wash over. His uncle had not run away, but had been living in secret beneath the very dock they used to. He wondered why Arthur would choose to live in a dark hole and watch the world from the... He returned to his truck and grabbed his phone to call the local sheriff to report his very strange. The sheriff arrived an hour later and looked at the hatch and the concrete room with a look of... According to dispatch logs, the police had searched the fishing camp dozens of times but never found the secret. They found a small crawl space behind the cot that led even deeper into the earth beneath the lake. The officers found skeletal remains wrapped in an old wool blanket at the very end of the narrow dirt. Forensic evidence later suggested that Arthur had died of natural causes sometime in the late 1980s or early. He had lived his final years in total isolation while watching the people he loved from a distance. Gideon stood on the dock and watched the sun begin to set over the trees in a golden... He thought about all the times he had visited the lake and never knew his uncle was right. The truth was finally revealed after 30 years of silence and mystery at the edge of the remote boat. The water of the lake remained still and dark, as if it were trying to keep the remaining secrets. Gideon realized that some people choose to live in the shadows because the light of the world is too... He looked at the old photograph one last time before handing it over to the sheriff for the official. The man in the reflection was smiling, and he seemed to be at peace with his choice to remain. Gideon drove away from the fishing camp and felt a strange sense of closure that he had not expected. The mystery of the boat dock was finally solved, but the story would be told in the town for... He knew that he would never look at a wooden pier the same way ever again in his long. The secrets of the water are often closer than we think, and they wait for the right person to... He reached the main road and watched the lake disappear in his rearview mirror as the night finally. The remote boat dock sat empty in the moonlight, and the water lapped gently against the old gray wooden. Every image tells a story, but some pictures capture things that should not exist in the real world at. This particular investigation proved that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones that are hiding in plain sight. Gideon Vance continued his work as a surveyor, but he always looked a little closer at the ground beneath. He never found another secret room, but he always felt the presence of the past in every old. The fishing camp was eventually torn down, and the dock was removed to make way for a new. The concrete room was filled with sand, and the hatch was sealed shut with a thick layer of heavy. No one would ever live beneath the water of the lake again, and the missing persons were finally given. The story of Arthur Vance became a part of the local history and a warning to those who seek. Gideon kept the old notebook as a reminder of the uncle he never truly knew during his own. The words in the notebook were a bridge between two lives that were separated by a thin layer of. Reportedly, the residents of the small town still avoid the area around the old lake when the sun goes. They say that the ghost of the observer can still be seen standing at the end of the new. Witness statements claim that a faint blue light sometimes glows from beneath the surface of the water on stormy. Gideon ignored the rumors and focused on the facts that he had discovered inside the dark and hidden concrete. He knew that his uncle was not a monster, but a man who was lost in his own private. The photographs were not meant to be a threat, but were the only way he could stay connected to. Life is often more complex than the stories we tell ourselves to explain the things we do not understand. The remote boat dock was a symbol of a life lived on the edge of two different worlds. Silas Thorne and Arthur Vance were two men who shared a similar fate in the quiet woods of Northern. Gideon was the one who finally brought their stories into the light for the rest of the world to. He spent many evenings sitting on his own porch and looking at the stars that reflected in the dark. The memory of the metal box and the rusted padlock remained clear in his mind even as years. He had learned that the truth is often buried beneath layers of mud and time and requires patience too. The silence of the lake was no longer a mystery, but a comfort to the man who found the. Every dock has a story, and every surveyor has a case that they will never forget for as long. Gideon Vance was a man who saw the world through a lens of logic, but he learned to. The remote boat dock was his final mystery, and the one that stayed with him until the very farewell. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind in the pines and the water on the shore. The story was finished, and the circle was finally closed for the family of the man who watched. A dispatcher who heard something no one else did. The Regional Emergency Communications Center was a long, windowless room that sat on the quiet outskirts of the city. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old veteran of the graveyard shift who was known for his incredible hearing. He often spent his 12-hour shifts listening to the subtle rhythms of the facility and the city around him. Silas could distinguish the sound of a failing hard drive from the normal hum of the massive cooling fan units. His coworkers frequently teased him about his ability to hear a mouse scurrying behind the drywall of the break room. The night of November 12th started out as a very typical Tuesday with only a few calls regarding minor incidents. Most of the city was asleep, and the digital maps on the wall showed very little movement in the streets. Silas sat in his ergonomic chair and adjusted the volume on his specialized high-definition headset while sipping cold coffee. He watched the seconds tick by on the digital clock as the center reached its quietest point of the night. The clock on the wall shifted toward 3 in the morning when a sudden flicker appeared on his primary console. A single line lit up indicating an incoming emergency call, but there was no caller identification or location data. Silas pressed the button to accept the connection and gave his standard professional greeting into the small black microphone. He heard a very strange rhythmic tapping followed by a series of melodic chimes that sounded like a toy. The dispatcher asked the caller to state the nature of their emergency and provide a specific location for the units. There was no verbal response, but the music continued to play with a haunting and distorted quality in his ears. Silas signaled his supervisor, Victor Vance, to listen in on the mysterious line to help identify the strange source. Victor plugged his own headset into the secondary jack and listened intently for nearly 30 seconds before shaking his head. The supervisor told Silas that the line was completely silent and that he only heard the standard digital carrier hum. Silas insisted that a very specific nursery rhyme was playing, but the audio visualizer on the screen remained perfectly flat. The computer system indicated that no sound was being transmitted from the other end of the open telephone connection at. Silas adjusted his volume to the absolute maximum level and felt a cold chill as the music grew much louder. He recognized the tune as a popular nursery rhyme from his early childhood, but the tempo was much slower now. The call disconnected after exactly 60 seconds, leaving Silas in a state of deep confusion as he stared at monitors. Victor told him it was likely a hardware glitch or a ghost call caused by moisture in the underground cables. Silas could not stop thinking about the melody and decided to check the digital archives for any similar previous calls. He spent the next 3 hours scrolling through audio logs from the past decade, but found nothing that matched it. The dispatcher reached out to a department technician named Julian Reed to ask if the recording system could fail. Julian explained that the digital compression might strip away certain analog signals if they were extremely weak or very high. Silas realized that he might be the only person who could hear the signal because of his sensitive, specialized. He began researching the history of the industrial district and discovered it was once home to a large toy factory. The factory had reportedly burned down in 1995, and the entire area remained fenced off for many years. Silas found an old newspaper article about a missing child named Arlo Finch who disappeared near the factory grounds then. The article mentioned that Arlo was carrying a custom music box when he was last seen by his worried parents. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline as he connected the melody from the call to the description in the. He pulled the original police report from 1995 and noted the last known location of the missing boy. The report stated that the search was called off after 2 weeks because the ground was considered too unstable. Silas looked at the modern coordinates from the mysterious call and saw they matched the old factory basement location. He decided to visit the site during his lunch break because the mystery was keeping him from focusing on work. The industrial district was a desolate maze of rusted metal and crumbling brick walls covered in thick green ivy. Silas climbed over a collapsed section of the perimeter fence and walked toward the center of the old factory. He carried a handheld radio and a flashlight as he navigated through the debris and scattered remnants of iron machinery. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as he discovered a small opening in the concrete floor that led down into a sub-basement that was not. Silas lowered himself into the dark space and swept his flashlight across the dusty room until he saw it. Resting on a rusted metal shelf was a music box that looked remarkably well preserved despite the decades of decay. He reached out to touch the wooden casing and noticed a thin copper wire running from the box. The wire was connected to an ancient telephone junction box that was still receiving a very low amount of. Silas realized that the shifting of the building had caused the music box to wind up and trigger the cried. He heard a soft sound behind him and turned his light toward a corner where a small crawlspace was. Inside the crawlspace, he found a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to the missing boy from 1990. There were sketches and a small denim jacket along with a journal that described how the boy had hidden. The journal revealed that Arlo had found a way to survive for a short time by accessing a nearby. Silas called the police department and requested an immediate forensic team to secure the site and recover the remains. The investigation revealed that Arlo had become trapped after a structural collapse and could not find his way out. The music box had been his only comfort, and it somehow remained functional through a bizarre set of mechanicals slongly. Technicians confirmed that the copper wire had acted as a primitive antenna that broadcast the sound during the heavy. The local news reported that the mystery of the missing boy was finally solved because of an observant emergency. Silas returned to his job at the communications center, but he never looked at the console in the same. He often wondered how many other voices were trapped in the old wires of the city waiting for someone. The music box was eventually placed in a museum as a reminder of the strange events that occurred. Victor apologized for doubting Silas and admitted that sometimes the technology we rely on does not capture the entire torn. The dispatcher felt a sense of peace, knowing that Arlo was no longer lost in the dark beneath the potty. He continued to work the graveyard shift and kept his headset volume high during the quietest hours of the time. Every time the clock struck 3, Silas would pause and listen for the faint melodic chimes of a. The city remained quiet, but the wires were alive with the echoes of stories that were never meant to. People in the town spoke about the miracle of the call for years and how the past found. Silas stayed at his post and watched the lights of the city while the world slept through